The subject of this episode might seem boring to you, but it's one of the most interesting I've ever recorded. Before this, I never gave any thought to the subject of pensions. I thought it's a boring, wonky subject. It affects only old people. Why should I care? But as I found out while recording this, the concept of pensions and the design of pension schemes can change society. How many children one has, what families look like, how we choose to live our lives, even the relations between parents and children. Pensions affect everything. As one of my guests today, Ajay Shah, says, pensions can reshape an entire society. And we are facing a giant pensions crisis in India now, which is also a political crisis, an economic crisis, a social crisis. I was blown away by some of the things I learned in this episode. Do listen.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen, our weekly podcast on economics, politics, and behavioral science. Please welcome your host, Amit Varma.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen. In a recent episode of mine, the great J.P. Narayan spoke about how the one issue keeping him up at night was India's pensions crisis. That intrigued me, and I looked further. Now here's the thing. A couple of decades ago, India had a pension scheme for its government employees which was out of whack and threatened to eventually bankrupt the country. It was estimated that at some point, 3% of India's people, the elites who work for government, would be supported by 68% of GDP. This was crazy, and it obviously could not scale. Unlike some Western countries, we'd never be able to cover the whole population, and even supporting the 3% could take us to financial ruin. Luckily for us, wonks, bureaucrats, and then politicians figured this out, and something called the NPS, or the New Pension Scheme, was designed. This was implemented from 2004 onwards, and it removed the future fiscal burden on the state. The Vajpayee government championed it and made it happen. The Manmohan Singh government realized how important the NPS was and supported it. There was political consensus. There was a triumph of sound economic thinking. So what's the problem? Well, the NPS was hard to understand for its beneficiaries. The nature of politics changed, becoming ultra-polarized. And today, across different states in the country, the old pension scheme, or the OPS, is making a comeback. And it is a disaster. It doesn't help those who are supposed to benefit from it, and it will end up bankrupting the country. Now, I wanted to record an episode that is not just a primer for this current crisis, but also the definitive guide on pensions themselves, how they originated and evolved worldwide, how they reshape societies, all the way to this current crisis. And my guests for this are Ajay Shah and Renuka Sane. Ajay was one of the people who actually worked on the design of the NPS. He was part of the finance ministry under both Vajpayee's NDA and Manmohan's UPA governments, and perhaps knows the NPS as well as anyone alive. Renuka has worked in the NPS for the last few years and is also one of India's top experts on this subject. Ajay really groks the subject till 2004, and Renuka has actively worked on this in the last 10 years, so you'll hear more from Ajay in the first half of this episode and vice versa in the second half. Also, on some episodes, I focus on the people I am with because I love oral histories and personal journeys, and on some episodes, I focus on subjects. In this case, the subject is everything. It is huge, it is important, we must all pay attention. So we get directly to pensions after about 15 minutes of the conversation, and along with pension talk, you also get to hear some mind-blowing fundas about society, as well as juicy political stories from Ajay's time working with Vajpayee's and Manmohan's teams. So listen. Hey, the music started and this sounds like a commercial, but it isn't. It's a plea from me to check out my latest labor of love, a YouTube show I am co-hosting with my good friend, the brilliant Ajay Shah. We've called it Everything is Everything. Every week, we'll speak for about an hour on things we care about, from the profound to the profane, from the exalted to the everyday. We range widely across subjects and we bring multiple frames with which we try to understand the world. Please join us on our journey and please support us by subscribing to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Amit Varma, AMITVARMA. The show is called Everything is Everything. Please do check it out. Renuka, welcome to The Seen and the Unseen.
Thank you, Amit. Happy to be here.
Ajay, welcome to The Seen and the Unseen.
Is this the 11th time?
I don't know what time this is, but you are quickly becoming the Mike Munger to my Russ Roberts. Samajhne wale samajh jayenge. Renuka, there's a question that Ajay and I both have for you, and that question is this: are you a good person?
As a good economist and someone concerned with measurement, I will say define good first.
So Ajay, go ahead and define good for her. You know exactly what I'm talking about.
Renuka, in the class of episodes of Everything is Everything, what fraction have you heard?
50%.
That makes you 50% good.
Chalo, getting there.
Yeah, yeah. So I'll again remind listeners that Ajay and I have this YouTube show which we've been doing for many weeks now called Everything is Everything. It's only an hour of cheerful conversation about many things. Do check that out if you haven't already. Unfortunately, I have long said I have a face for audio, so you can see that on the show. But today we are going to kind of talk about this subject that I first got switched on to when JP Narayan mentioned it in his episode with me, and he considered it like the thing that keeps him awake at night and perhaps India's biggest crisis. And to me, it almost seemed such a mundane subject. Pensions. Like, where's the crisis? What's going on? It's just a policy thing. You move around numbers here and there. But before we get to the subject, I want to chat a little bit with Renuka to kind of figure out. And don't worry, we won't do an hour or 3 hours because you have promised us a full episode where we will discuss Renuka's revels in regulation
Yes, in the future.
in the
Deep
future.
in the future.
In the future, but I want to start off by asking you to introduce yourself to my listeners. Who are you? What do you do? What keeps you awake at night?
I am an economist. I work at the Trustbridge Rule of Law Foundation. We are a new organization that works on areas of rule of law in the economy. I began my research career with pensions, so that was many, many years ago. And it's quite amusing that as a young person, I was worried about pensions. From pensions, I've sort of moved on to other areas allied to pensions, such as portfolio choice of households, and then started worrying about financial regulation as it interfaces with portfolio choice of households. And from there, I started worrying about regulation as it interfaces with everything else. And so I think that's sort of the broad areas of work that I have done in the past and hope to do in the future.
So I want to ask you a question that, when and Ajay and I have, discussed this in various different kind of forms and ways, that when I look at people within any profession, a large percentage of them are going through the motions. They got the credentials to get the job. They're going through the motions. They might be technically good. They might have knowledge. They don't have passion. They don't stay up at night. They don't really care. What I've seen with Ajay is he obviously cares about his work. That reflects in the choices that he's made and the things that we speak about. And perhaps there is a selection bias at play here, but a lot of the people who I've seen working with Ajay or met through him, like you, are exactly like that. Like, you people are deep in the weeds because you love it, right? And you really care about it, and so on and so forth. So tell me a little bit sort of about that in your profession, which is, I mean, I don't even know how you describe it. Are you a think tanky? Are you a policy person? Are you an economist doing one particular thing? But in your field, I have met, so many people who are just lifeless, not in the way they come across in person because, they can party, but in terms of really caring about the subject beyond, what they need to do. So tell me a little bit about your journey in this field and your journey in this field, and have you had ebbs and flows in terms of how much you care about it? Do you feel apathetic sometimes? Just give me a sense of
Sure.
that.
So I think I was always energetic and always scared, and which is why I kind of self-selected myself into this group of people. So I think that is endogenous, and then it's a cycle, right? So you're around people who care a lot and who are doing these amazing things, and it rubs off on you. And so you try and inculcate some of those ways of being into your life. And I think that's sort of been how it is for the last 20 years. Yes, there are ebbs and flows because sometimes you get disappointed at what is going on, and some of it just seems so obviously wrong and destructive. And very often, many people like us can do nothing about it. So those are periods where you feel very disappointed. You also feel worried about where all of this is going. But at the same time, perhaps the way to think about it is many other people have a say, and it's a good thing that there is this conflict between various people who have a stake in how some of this is going, and that's how it's playing out, and that's how it should play out. So I think that's what keeps me going.
And a question for both of you, but first Renuka, and you would have seen it in different ways, partly in the same way, but Ajay being a boss and a mentor to so many people, an additional kind of angle, which is that it is not that some people are naturally apathetic and some people are naturally concerned and passionate. I think what happens is we have both those aspects within us, and then it becomes a company we choose to keep that also shapes us. You could get into a vicious cycle of apathy where no one around you gives a shit, so you are like, why should I give a shit? My work counts for nothing. Or you could be in a virtuous cycle where you see deeply passionate people who are like, shit, this stuff matters and we have to, we'll never get the credit for the work we do. We may never see it happening in our lifetimes. No one will associate it with us, but it is work that will do good and therefore we have to do it. So is that a correct characterization that it can either be a virtuous cycle or a vicious cycle, and who you hang out with, who you surround yourself with can kind of determine that? And do you feel therefore being in the kind of space that you are makes you a fundamentally different person? You could have been somebody else entirely. And after you had also, like Ajay, to sort of talk about what he's seen through a sort of a longer arc of working with people in the field.
I think you will find people like you, and you will find those that inspire you and keep you going wherever you are. So it doesn't matter. So I feel that those that are interested will find circles that give this back to them and be in a position where they are always thinking and always producing something.
Ajay, does it hang by a fragile thread?
Yeah, I feel that particularly in the early years, for all of us, myself included, there is a great pressure to seek external validation and to climb well established ladders. So, other people's definitions of what is sound and what is good and what is useful and what constitutes success and earning respect is a very big deal. And, there are mundane problems like finding a job and, getting going on some of the basics. So I feel it's an uphill battle for most people. There's a combination of the inner values and some amount of good luck on whether we each of us will land up onto some kinds of virtuous cycles or not. So I feel that we in India are very poor on the institution building, on the community building. We're wasting lots of talent. And by default, there is just a whole world of credentialism and brand names that seems to occupy most people. And by the way, most research jobs in India are driven by credentialism. So getting a job requires getting the right things on your resume.
Maybe one day we should speak in detail about how that can be disrupted. But I remember in episode 11 of Everything is Everything, you spoke about the importance of purpose. And that both makes me hopeful that there are people who find that purpose and will do anything for it. But it also makes me a little despondent because I think that, hey, we should not have to rely on individuals finding purpose and doing good things.
But Amit, I feel that once you want to bring scale in anything, you will end up having some amount of standardization, and that is inevitable. So there is always a trade-off between purpose and some people doing amazing things and stepping out of the ordinary. But it's very difficult to build scale on that. So even if you look at university systems overseas, which are way ahead of us, they have scale, and therefore they have some amount of standardization and what is good and what is successful and what is well regarded. And I think that's a trade-off. And I don't see it as badly as Ajay does, because perhaps at least that is better than not having anything.
When we look abroad, it is indeed true that there are many organizations that work reasonably well, and they've also got an entire ecosystem worked out of the journals and the funding mechanisms. And what is particularly pernicious in India is the craving for the foreign journals. And in the humanities and social sciences, it is just dangerous because the editors and the referees outside have no clue about what are the important questions and what are the high quality persuasive papers. So it hurts India particularly. Whereas I respect what the French are doing for themselves. Their institutional apparatus, their journals, their incentives, their funding mechanisms are working reasonably well to scale. But what is happening in a lot of humanities and social sciences in India is that attempt at short circuiting through the complexities of community building and saying, I want you to be in the American journals. I feel that's a truly harmful thing.
It's true. I don't disagree with you. But the counterfactual is that since we don't have a local ecosystem, you will end up being nothing. So at least here, you have some quality metric. So we could argue whether that is the best place to be, but it's certainly not the worst place to be.
Right, and I've and in many episodes of this show, and including with Ajay, and I perhaps got the thought first from him, and then started thinking about it. I've spoken of what I call the academic circle jerk, and I'm using this term, listeners. It is not Ajay; he doesn't use such unparliamentary language. But the academic circle jerk, where you are playing a game that is disconnected from reality, and Ajay is lamented, if I've understood him correctly, and I share the lament that a tremendous amount of talent and brain power is lost to the world because you're playing that game where you want the credential, you want the tenure, you want the pubs, you want all of that. But there are real world problems which you are not addressing because you have to play that particular game, which may often reflect the fashions of the times in terms of the kind of work you do, and not really real world problems. Ajay's story is kind of documented through all the episodes I've had with him. And we, of course, do Everything is Everything every week. Everything is Everything every week. But in your case, Renuka, have you ever felt different pulls towards one direction or the other? Because the direction you've chosen, in a sense, there are other directions which could have paid you much more, and there are other directions also which could have gotten you, perhaps greater glory of a different sort within the limited academic world or whatever. And yet you choose to work in a field where it is going to be very hard for anyone outside this field to understand when you say, I did that. Right? So, what's it been like for you?
Well, very often you can't say that I did that because you alone never do anything. You're always part of a larger group of people. And even that is often not known that you were part of something bigger. But it has not really bothered me too much. There are obviously points in time where you do feel the pressure of wanting to be regarded by certain set of people, but you get over that very quickly because I've always loved and valued what I am doing. And I'm lucky enough to be a part of a circle that does appreciate this. So it's not as if I am this lone warrior who is just doing something because she believes in it and then there is no feedback mechanism. So there is, it's very important to have a feedback mechanism. It's very important to have a community that values what you do, which helps you disregard other communities. And I've been fortunate to have that.
Great. So I want to spend a few hours digging into the details of that, and we shall do that someday. But to kind of get to the subject at hand today, which is such an urgent and important subject, and I'm hoping that what we discuss today can sort of act as both an introduction and a resource to that subject at hand. Ajay, give me a brief introduction to this subject at a very meta level. Like, what are pensions? Tell me a little bit about the origin of the thinking behind them, because it's one of these words and one of these concepts which we normalize, right? I have never thought about it for even 60 seconds at a time. You kind of grow up and you think, pensions, okay, when people retire, they get a pension, and maybe the government pays it, maybe they kind of contribute it, and etc., etc., and no one's really quite sure of the mechanics. But when you're young, why the hell should you care? You're a long way from growing old, and you don't think about larger issues as well, about how it can become a political tool, how it has an impact on state finances, and therefore all our money, because what after all are state finances but our money, and why it should lead to the kind of ginormous crisis that it has. But I want to step back a bit. You're speaking to someone who knows, which is me, who knows absolutely zero about this subject. Give me an introduction.
So let's start step by step. In the olden days, let's think 19th century, before antibiotics, life expectancy was low and most work was manual labor. It involved physical strength. So people would reach the end of their lives, in the end of their working lives, and lose the ability to have that level of physical strength. And then they would live for a short time before they would die. Okay. And that was that zone of retirement where there were only a few years left. And just to fix intuition, imagine that you stop working at about 55 and you die at about 60. Okay, so we're discussing a 5-year problem that people lost the ability to do physical labor by about 55, and they lasted for about 5 years, so 7 years after that. This is a typical 19th century configuration. And ever since prehistory, the elderly have lived at home, been supported by children and grandchildren, and that was the normal way in which people found social support and community and financial support and caregiving in the last years of their life. In Bismarck's Germany, there was a port where the port workers invented a concept. They came up with this idea that when the person stops working, they take the last wage of that person, suppose it's 100 rupees, and focus on half of that wage. So it's about 50 rupees a month. And this half wage was paid to the person until they died. And this money was contributed by all active workers. Okay, so all the workers got together and funded the support of a few elderly people. And there were only a few elderly people because they died relatively quickly. Okay, this immediately takes us to the word dependency ratio, which is the number of working people versus the number of retired people. So here for the first time, you got a new concept around retirement, that there was a systematic mechanism to pay a person half their terminal wage until they died. And there was a funding mechanism that this was taken from the persons then living. Okay, so this was the world's first formal conception of pensions.
So does this mean, just to clarify how it would work, say Renuka and I are working and you're about to retire, or you retire, let's say. So every month a little bit of our income is taken, say 2%, and that then goes into funding the very few elderly people who they are. And chances are that out of Renuka and I, 1.5 of the two of us will probably die anyway before we reach that age. So the burden on the actual active workers will be very small.
And also the active workers are given this nice promise that, look, when you get old, it'll be your turn. So there's a certain justice about that when I'm young, I'm funding old people. And when I become old, the future young will fund me.
And
So
was this mandated by the state, or would organizations themselves
this began
institute?
literally as a labor initiative and gradually started becoming more and more formalized. So I'm right at the very beginning. This was the first pension. And then this became more and more formalized. Particular importance for us is that this became a part of the British civil service. And through that, it came to India. That a civil servant, like your father, would retire originally at 58 and then at 60, and then they would be paid 50% of their wage until they died. Okay, so this is the early conception of pension, and there is a technical word for this. It's called a defined benefit pension. Why is that? Because that benefit, 50 rupees, is defined. So I finish work with a wage of 100, I'm guaranteed that there will be a pension of 50, 50, 50, 50 until I die. There's no income uncertainty for the old person until they die. There may be health care expenditure uncertainty. There will be many other kinds of uncertainty. There's, of course, longevity risk. But this part is guaranteed, and it was called a defined benefit pension.
Couple of quick questions. One is, and I'm making assumptions, tell me if they're correct. And one assumption is that in these times and before these times, before we achieve the kind of prosperity that we have in modern times, most people would have been living pretty much cheek by jowl, a month at a time. And therefore, the elderly, if their kids take care of them, and I'm guessing that family structures also then play into that. So with greater prosperity, that family structure may no longer be required. But at the same time, so that's one assumption I'm making. And the other assumption I'm making is that it would have been attractive to a worker to join a company that offers pensions, because people weren't skipping jobs all the time. If you joined a factory, I'm guessing you would work. There's a chance that you might retire there. And therefore it is attractive to you that there is a pension scheme.
So many rabbit holes to go into. I shall be very disciplined. I shall give you one line answers which just point to the rabbit hole. Okay, so you said a person joins a company and would be attracted to getting that pension. Now, immediately you got to worry about several things. First, what if a person moves jobs? So now you want something more complicated, that if I work 5 years for this company and 7 years for that company, in a way you want to attach a liability to those companies and take money somehow from them when I am retired. It's very complicated. And in developed countries, these kinds of things have been attempted. And this is the way in which the state gets into these structures. Okay. The second thing is, you talked about the word family. Uh, it it sounds cold and cruel, but you know what? Parents respond to incentives. Yeah, does that seem like a revolutionary idea? So actually, when formal sector pension provisions come about, then the behavior of parents towards children, of children towards parents, does change. So parents are less inclined to build a portfolio of children when they can build a portfolio of financial wealth. Okay, and I promised only one sentence, but I cannot resist one more sentence. Did you know? Did you know? Did you know? Um, if a parent converts a stock of wealth into a flow of monthly pensions, then the wealth is gone and the parent is getting a flow of pensions until they die. Okay, so there's less money available to bequeath. Such parents, on average, get fewer visits from their children.
Mind blowing. And it also plays to that old thing about how, the poor tend to have more children. And I use this as and one reason obviously is insurance. They can afford, they can't afford such good healthcare, and therefore child mortality and all of that is a factor. But also the poor have more children because children are a resource, which gives a lie to the popular notion that population is a bad thing. The poor have more kids because they need more resources. And what you're saying here is, if the promise of a pension is a future resource, then the pressure on you to have kids goes down, and equally the kids are also responding to incentives.
Yeah. Yeah. So we're dealing with fundamental features of the human life. We are discussing all through the working years where there is some way in which resources go away from the young. There are a couple of different ways to organize it. And then you come to retirement and the relationship with children, the relationship with formal promises of pension until death. So these are very important questions which shape everybody. Renuka joked about being a young person who was interested in pensions. It is unfortunately pretty universally true that people in their 20s believe they're going to live forever. And
No. On the contrary, people in their 20s will often tell me that I think I'm only going to live till 60 because, I don't want to live longer and I don't want to be old.
That's fashionable, but yeah, no one buys that. I was like, when I was 18, I thought I want to die at 27 because that's when all the rock stars died, right? Jimi Hendrix, Jim Morrison, all that. Then later I thought, when I was 22, I thought, no, not 5 more years, 33, because a whole bunch of others died then. So you kind of romanticize this. And, to me, to the 18-year-old me, it would have been astonishing and terribly sad that the 49-year-old me is sitting here right now.
Exactly, but you can see how that shapes your investment and portfolio choices because at that age, you don't see how long you're going to live. In fact, if you ask 40-year-olds today, they will tell you that they want to be done with by 75.
which is completely wrong. So longevity has gone up, as we've discussed many times. So Professor Sane is going to live and live to 110 years.
What is the difference between live and live and live and live?
Just keep plodding on. Just it goes on and on. 110.
So not just live, but also live life in all its full glory and all of that. No, I'm kind of staggered by this notion that a thing like pension, which seems such a dry financial arrangement, can actually change the structure of society in terms of how many children people have and how those children treat their parents and
how the parents treat their children. So these are fundamental things. So pensions is so important. It reshapes society. I'm going to rapidly talk about how it involves staggering amounts of money.
You don't have to be too rapid.
Comes with many dangers.
Assure you, this is not everything is everything. This is the seen and the unseen.
Yeah, we have ample time. Yeah, but I did want to say that this stuff is fundamental and it has huge ramifications for everybody.
So let's continue with the narrative that you were on, so Bismarck institutes this. It is initially something that labor pushes for. Then gradually it gets formalized and it becomes almost a new normal in a sense, and it becomes part of the workplace. But all these complexities are also coming up. What if I shift jobs from one company to the other? And and then over a period of time, of course, what if people live longer, and etc., etc.
So there is a whole bunch of problems here. For simplicity, for starters, let's stick to civil service. So I don't want to get into multiple employers. You will see as we tell the story, actually, there is a beautiful solution for all these problems. But just to understand the problems and how they unfold, let's stick to civil service. The British brought the traditional civil service pension into India, what is now called OPS, the old pension system, okay, which is 50% of your terminal wage. Now, what is the value of this pension? Okay, so being as a finance person, if you stand at age 60 and think of a list of promises where there is a payment of 50 rupees happening every month, going on until death, and death is itself an uncertain process. You're going to die at some point with various probabilities. So we attach probabilities of survival till time t, and there are promises, and you can NPV all that, and you get the actuarial value of the promise. Okay? And so what is the value of this promise? It obviously varies enormously with longevity. So in a world where people would retire at 58 and die by 65, then there's really nothing much going on. It's a small amount of money. But then longevity exploded. An important thing to remember in India is that civil servants are really top decile people in India. Okay, there are no poor people who become civil servants. The bulk of civil servants are from the top quartile, top decile of society. These are the people who have the best mortality of India. They're going to live the most. So when you take population averages, it lulls us into complacence. When you take the average life expectancy at 60, in the general population, it seems like a small number. But by the time you're getting to top quartile, top decile people, you are discussing better health, better knowledge, better access to healthcare. And then the residual years left after age 60 become longer and longer. And as you go down that route, the value of that promise balloons. In this, we have to deal with the question of indexation. Okay, there are three kinds of indexation that we need to think about and understand. So one kind of pension is a nominal promise. I just promise you 50 rupees. And when inflation comes, the 50 gets whittled away. Okay, so that is the first kind of pension that can be done, and it should be on the table. It should be considered. This takes us to macroeconomic stability. In the olden days in India, inflation was much more unpredictable. Every now and then there would be an inflation surge and the value of the rupee would be whittled down. In 2015, the Reserve Bank of India got a formal mandate to live on an inflation target of 4%. So now hopefully, to the extent that RBI is able to rise to this challenge, people are protected into the deep future, saying there's a predictable 4% inflation. Yes, 4% is not zero, but it's something that you can predict and you can plan around. And then, maybe there is a role for a nominal pension where the 50 rupees declines in value every year at a 4% rate because the inflation hits the bullseye every year and gets to 4%. That's one world. The second world is that the pension is inflation indexed. Okay. Now, this is very expensive. It means the pension is bumped up by 4% every year, or whatever is the inflation rate. This is a different ballgame altogether. So now when you NPV this product, it is resulting in vastly greater expenditure for the pension giver. Because, over a 20, 30, 40-year horizon, you're bumping up the payment by either 4% if RBI hits the bullseye, or whatever inflation may be, depending on how badly RBI fails to hit the bullseye. Okay, so this is a different product. It's a much more expensive product. And finally, the third and the costliest idea is called wage indexing. Okay, so this is the idea that imagine I retire as a secretary to the government. Now my pension is set to 50% of the secretary to government, but I'm going to live for 30 years more. Now, through those 30 years, every time the wage of a secretary to government goes up, my pension is bumped up to remain at 50% of the wage of a secretary to government at a future date. That's a phenomenally expensive pension, because now you're factoring in GDP growth into the pension. So the wage of the secretary will grow with Indian GDP. It's going to grow at a hectic rate compared to inflation. There'll be real growth in the wage of a secretary to government because India is experiencing GDP growth. So this is a different level of promise altogether. Many people are a little glib about these differences, and I don't want to burden this show with numbers, but I just want to give you a qualitative flavor that the cost of these three things is chalk and cheese. They are often mixed up, and people casually suggest that you should do wage indexing, or you should do price indexing, or you should do no indexing. But each of these three implies profoundly different numbers. So this is something to keep in mind, and it's going to come up in a lot of the post 2004 debacle surrounding pensions that Renuka is going to talk about further.
Also, while we are talking about longevity, very often pensions are not just given to that person, but also promised to the spouse of that person. And so when we start thinking about longevity, it is not just the longevity of the person, but now the longevity of two people. So you can see how it just keeps going on into the future.
So now, with a certain probability, the spouse will outlive the other. If you think of in the patriarchy, on average, the male is 4 years older than the woman, and women have higher longevity. So now you're adding more years of a pensions journey that makes it more expensive.
So before we come to the implications of this, another further really basic meta question. We often take the structure of things for granted, and normalize them. And to me, it seems that and correct me if I'm wrong because I'm thinking aloud, but to me it seems that the pensions exist because people are really bad at financial planning. They don't understand mortality and longevity and what to do with money. And also, as Renuka said, that we have this illusion of the young thing, they'll never get old, and there's also this illusion of immortality where, like, there's an illusion of immortality where you behave as if you're never going to die, and therefore you don't plan for death and old age and all of those things. But you also have this sense that retirement and old age are a long way away, and therefore pension seems to be a sort of a good broader way to account for this, that individuals won't plan, can't plan, maybe irresponsible, maybe whatever. It's a basic human failing. The brain can't comprehend large numbers, and therefore here is this institutionalized solution which kind of takes care of the matter. But it makes me wonder if there are this one happened to arise. Bismarck did something, it spreads from there, convention spreads, mimetic factors take over. But are there other kind of arrangements which could possibly have evolved? Was it an accident of history, or was it inevitable that at some point we would have something like this? What could a different, better way of looking at this whole subject of how do humans plan for their old age have come about?
So I want to straight away jump into today's pension problem and how people in working age today should think about their future. There is a lot of evidence that shows us that abrupt transition into retirement is actually a curse. That when people stop working, it has tremendous adverse consequences, both in terms of the physical exercise of moving around and doing some work in the day, and also the whole psychic problem of then being alone and being uninteresting and unimportant, and nobody wants to talk to you, and you're not useful or valuable to anybody. These two things come together, and in many countries we have seen this data that it all sounds very romantic. Oh, I'm going to retire, I'll travel a bit. In 6 months, 9 months, that peters out, and then people rapidly get to health collapses and land up in old age nursing homes or die. So retirement is a curse, and I think most people have not adequately understood that. The idea of putting your boots up and retiring is actually something that should be considered abhorrent, and I think it is just a complete social blunder in somehow normalizing it and making it something that is venerated and something that is attractive. I feel it is a bad thing for everybody. So what is a desirable life design? Okay, for all of us, for all our viewers, the desirable life design is that there should be a gradual tailing off of work based on physical capabilities. So that regimented 9 to 5 full-time job with one employer has a finite window, and sooner or later everybody should get out of it. Meaning, you pick what age you want to walk out of that. Some lucky souls like you have essentially never done that. Okay, but
I've
many
done it for a while, but yeah,
yeah, so I think it's a rite of passage. We've all got to do it for some time, but the sooner you can get out of that and live a much more open-ended, flexible, creative life, the better. And then the critical thing it does is it creates flexibility. So I feel as we get older and as physical incapacity creeps in, not it creeps in, it's seldom abrupt. Physical incapacity creeps in. Then we should dynamically reduce our labor supply and do fewer hours a week and do the things that we consider interesting. And that way, labor supply tails off into old age and doesn't abruptly go to zero at age 60. And people are vigorous, they are physically energetic, people are moving around. It's great for their health. They are sought after. There are people who want them to do some work for them. It is just great for the physical and mental health. For every older person that I love, I dream that they will keep on doing some amount of labor supply until they die. This thing about tailing off and dropping to retirement is an industrial revolution concept. It is a curse in the modern world. I would wish it on nobody.
I have two related questions, one leading on for the other for both of you. And one is that what you describe is, it seems to me, something that you and I can do. That as we grow frailer, we can prioritize what we want to do with our lives, and we can reduce our labor supply, as you put it, and we can figure that stuff out. But we're incredibly privileged. I think a lot of people who are, especially in poorer countries like India and so on, who are living hand to mouth existences and all of that, can't really, they don't really have a choice in the matter. If there is mandated retirement, it is incredibly painful and horrible in all the ways that you describe, both financial and psychological. They don't have that choice open to them. This is question one. And question two, which I'd like to know what you both of you think about it, is what you spoke about, Ajay, is that sort of that loss of purpose at one level, dignity at another level. After you retire, that you don't have work, you're no longer important. Kal aap boss the, office ja rahe the, now you're no longer important. You don't and you don't have that structure to your day. All your life you had a structure to your day, a structure to your week. You no longer have structure, and that can be absolutely freaking horrible. And supposing we get past the implicit problem in the first question and get to a point where there is enough prosperity in the world, let's say AI takes productivity so high that the state can afford a massive UBI, and none of us have to work again. Nobody has to work again. But yet, in this scenario, what people will often say is that work still has value. Work is not just about earning money. So what are sort of your thoughts on that? Like, how would you react to that sort of situation where you don't have to work for a living, and how do you think humanity would react to such a situation?
So, first, I want to get on the poverty question. That poverty is a terrible problem. That's unconditionally true. And the single highest purpose for all of us in India should be to figure out how to become an advanced economy so that some of that brute grinding poverty goes away. Everything I am saying is about questions like 100 rupees a month of income versus 50 rupees a month of pension. And maybe 100 is a terrible place to be. Maybe 50 is a terrible place to be. We're not here to solve that. So just keep the poverty discussion separate from the pensions discussion. The pensions discussion is a percentage of your last income. And so if you're poor, a small fraction of a bad number is a bad number.
I think that when we are talking about pensions and pensions being 50% of the last wage, it applies to a very small section of the population, certainly in India, because only civil servants get that pension. And perhaps people in larger formal sector organizations are part of some other program where they get something at the end of their working life. So I think this question of if you look at the large part of India, it's irrelevant because nobody is getting
exist.
It doesn't exist. Nobody is getting 50% of last wage. And even on the question of work and this idea of retirement, it only applies to those who have a job where there is a retirement age. Most of India does not have jobs, and therefore the relevant question is, at what age would you withdraw from the labor force, and not at what age you retire, because retire is very much a function of some formal sector employment where there is some last date of work after which you will get something from your employer or from the state.
So in India, if you are a fruit seller or a chartered accountant or a podcaster or a myriad self-employed roles, there is no concept of retirement date, and there is that flexibility of gradually phasing out work. In the formal sector where there are proper 9 to 5 jobs, I will import a little bit of the first world discourse. The first world discourse is that the institutions of the labor market need to change, reflecting aging societies, and create much more flexibility whereby older people can participate in the labor force, where older people are able to do a half day or 2 days a week, and everything in society should be adjusting to fit that, because as the aging of society happens, it's a single gigantic problem which should drive changes in other things. It's the institutions of the labor market that should change in response to the needs of a aging society.
But Ajay, if I just, you take that and say that, look, in 80% of the workforce of India, we are already in a place where the labor market conditions exist, that nothing stops you from working. And as long as your health permits, you can continue to work. I want to sort of respond to the question that Amit asked before, which is what is the system that you would want in an environment like that? And I think that's where this whole question of building up wealth and then drawing down wealth whenever you are not able to work becomes important. And I think that too much of the pensions discourse has been hogged by the problems of longevity of a certain class of people who get that benefit, and much less is thought about the larger question of how do you build wealth so that you can finance consumption in old age. And I think that we need to broaden the pensions discourse to a larger saving discourse, to a larger portfolio optimization discourse, and to a larger question of how will you draw down that wealth. So sure, I worked till I'm 70 and I've accumulated this pot of money because I was diligent and I saved in some instrument. But now I might live for 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, who knows? How do I draw down that wealth? And I think that we haven't focused as much on those questions when it comes to pensions. And rightly so, because the problem staring us in the face is really the problem of making these promises to a small section of society, which we are most likely not going to be able to fulfill.
So civil servants are a tiny fraction of the Indian labor force, but unfortunately, from 1999 till today, we're stuck on solving that. And in fact, we've taken many steps backwards in retreating from what was thought to be a damn decent solution.
And we'll go into the weeds of all of that, but just responding to what you said, Renuka, it strikes me that those two problems, shifting from the problems of thinking about pensions for a limited group of people to thinking to widening the scope to thinking about savings in general and how we plan for our future, they seem to be in different domains. The first one is sort of in an institutional domain, where the political economy is involved and where institutions are involved. And the second one seems to be more in a cultural domain of how individuals think about their future and how they change their behavior. And we often act like herds. So there is a chance that one individual at a time, suddenly, mimetic desire takes over and, people begin to think differently en masse. But I would imagine that given that we are hardwired in ways where, we have that bias for optimism and in a particular context and an inability to grok large numbers, that cultural change to me seems very difficult, but that's an aside.
Yeah, but Amit, I'll respond. As you guys have often said, that culture is also a response to incentives and institutions. And the pensions community has done that. And, I can quibble about what they've done and what their focus has been when it comes to quote unquote informal sector pensions. But there is a move to get people to save more or bind people to accounts that are called pension accounts, just because they are illiquid. So once you enter that, you can't touch that money for the next 30, 40 years. And that's one way that you force people to put some money aside for pensions. And there are institutional structures that do that. And that's the response to the culture question.
No, in fact, I agree with you. I was just thinking aloud at what Ajay said earlier about how pensions, when they first came, provoke people to have less children as an example of culture and cultural and social attitudes and norms being influenced by an institutional mechanism. Even in this regard, I'm thinking let's take two wild thought experiments. In one wild thought experiment, you guarantee everyone, forget the fiscal practicality of it, but you guarantee everyone 200% pension after they retire. Whatever the last salary was, they'll get double of that a month. Their incentive to save has basically shot down drastically, and that will reshape a lot of the cultural and social attitudes. And vice versa, if you another thought experiment, you abolish pension entirely, then the incentive to save and so on. So their attitudes towards money just go to a whole different level. Their attitude towards consumption, how they live their lives, everything can change because of minor shifts in.
Yeah, pensions is that important. Pensions can reshape an entire society. And I'm going to come to it in a moment. The magnitudes of the money involved are so massive, it can bankrupt a government. So, pension promises, like health promises, are the two biggies which can destroy the fiscal soundness of even developed country governments, leave alone a much fiscally weaker government like India.
So we've come very far in the narrative, and I want to go back to that early part. Like the first evolution of pensions that you described is that people who are working are paying for those who have retired, who probably have 4 or 5 years to go, and most workers don't get there. But this begins to change in fundamental ways. One is you try to scale this up to bigger groups of people. Longevity goes up, so the people are living longer. Fertility rates change. The proportion of young to old in the workforce completely changes, and then shit starts going out of whack, and the numbers become hard to control because initially it's pay as you go, right? And on a
So let me
explain that
Yeah,
those
and
transitions.
you used a phrase, let's define it carefully. There are two ways to implement a defined benefit pension. Case one, meaning I'm the government. Okay, so let's just discuss civil servants and governments for right now. Case one, the government has salted money away upfront that pre-funds the payments that are made to the person who's about to retire. So that money is locked away and is kept safely ahead of time. That would be very nice because it removes all financial risk. But the alternative that most governments do is called pay as you go, which is like my Bismarck example, that there is no fund. You've not salted away the money ahead of time. You've not created a block of money that will pay for the pensions at future dates. What you plan to do is at a future date, whatever money I need for pensions, I'll go get it from the young at that time. Or to come to the Indian civil service situation, whatever is the money required for pensions, we'll just put it on the general budget. We will keep taxing the people. We'll extract money from the people to pay for that pension. This is called a pay-as-you-go pension. This starts becoming more troublesome because now you can be quite reckless. There is no fund, there's no discipline, there is no real cost calculus. Now the forces that are tugging at the pension system that you described, the longevity is going up, the demographic structure of the workforce is changing. These forces start yanking at the financial viability and the financial sanity of a pension arrangement. And there's really no force to pull back to sanity. This is where India found itself through the 80s and the 90s. Okay, so through the 80s and the 90s, there was this kind of pay-as-you-go pension that people would retire every year. The 50% pension was being paid to them, and it was funded out of general tax revenues. Somewhere down the line, the pay commissions became very generous. They started giving inflation indexation of the pensions. So suddenly, the pension started growing much faster than meets the eye because you're being indexed for inflation. And people started living longer. Longevity got higher. After a great upsurge of recruitment in the 60s and 70s, recruitment slowed down considerably by the mid 80s. So then the ratio of the old who are getting pensions versus the young workers who are inside the government started becoming more and more adverse. So all these things came together and it got crystallized in one number. On budget, year after year, you saw explosive growth in the pension outgo. This was starkly visible by the 90s, and people started doing simple mechanical extrapolation without a whole deal of data and analysis. But it became blindingly obvious that this thing is unsustainable, that this was growing at 15-18% a year, while the general government revenues and expenditures were growing at 10-11% a year. So these kinds of mismatches lead to very large divergences. And this is the kind of bind that the Indian state found itself in the late 90s.
Explain that 18% or 15 to 18% number to me, because if it's, say, inflation indexed and say inflation is 5%, then fine, if you're getting 50 rupees spend, if a particular guy retired at 100 rupees, he's getting 50 rupees pension, that becomes 52.5 the next year, and then 55 point something the year after that. So this is inflation indexing, but was there also wage indexing, or how do we or is it the number of people going up that also increases the wage bill and takes it up to
It was primarily about the demographic structure, about the age cohorts, that when there was a big surge in recruitment at 21, many years later, a whole bunch of people would retire. There was also petty fraud. So Railways was famous for paying pensions to lots of people who don't exist. So it was a mixture of.
Also, the pay commission rises. So, when you're in a system where your pension is 50% of your last wage or last 10 months' wage, then if towards the end of your working career there is a pay commission and you suddenly get a hike, then instead of 100 as your last wage, it's suddenly 200. And so, your pension for this cohort now, instead of being 50, is 100.
And so their incentives, they are the senior most civil servants, they're running the civil service. So their incentives are always to lobby the pay commission to give them higher hikes. And who mans the pay commission?
It's supposed to be a neutral technical body, but all too often pay commissions have had a very welfarist approach of trying to dole out more benefits rather than thinking hard-headedly about these consequences. Continuing on what she just said, there is another kind of behavior that's been normalized in the Indian state. A person is coming closer to retirement. It is considered a nice gesture to give that person one last promotion before they retire, because you basically get a higher pension forever, because the pension is 50% of your last wage. So very late in the career, it's almost a favor. It's a gesture that, the good people get one more promotion towards the end. So all these factors came together, and by the 90s, it was visible that there was an explosive growth in pensions. Just to make this more fun, the late 90s was also a terrible time in the economy. The Asian crisis emerged in August 1997. Vajpayee tested a nuclear device in May 1998, and there were sanctions against India from all over the world. And as a consequence, there was quite some fiscal stress. And we started seeing many state governments renege on pension payments to old people. Okay. And this takes me to the glorious question of how guaranteed is a guarantee. Okay. It sounds very easy to say Sarkar has guaranteed.
It's like the question, who will watch the watchman?
And defined benefit pensions are known to fail. It is just in the nature of the beast that the political economy is such that there is a concentrated interest in a small group of people, and in this case civil servants, a very influential group of people who are able to lobby and get atrocious promises made to themselves. But those promises are fundamentally unaffordable, and so later on governments just fail to pay those pensions. Governments renege. We found so much evidence by the late 90s of a couple of state governments of India just failing to pay pension. And so then you start thinking in fundamental ways that what is the point of a fancy promise if it is actually not upheld? What is worse than the uncertainty for an old person? That, on paper, I have a very good looking pension, but you know what? I'm not sure that the money will come. Now, suddenly, you're back to square A, that you have to actually self-insure. You have to create your own financial wealth. You can't trust these institutions. Now, you may say that this is just a third world problem. I mean, yes, of course, India is a third world country, and we have such minor third world problems. Astonishingly enough, many first world countries have reneged on defined benefit pension promises to their population. it's a bit non-comparable that those promises were made to the population, while here in India we're only discussing the civil service. But still, in first world countries, there are numerous episodes where the government has just stood in front of the people and said, sorry, I can't afford this, and I'm going to renege on the old people.
There are shades of grey to reneging, because one way you do that is by changing certain parameters of the pensions you get. So one is you just increase retirement age. So instead of retiring at 60, now you retire at 65 or you retire at 70. And in the OECD countries, you're seeing that retirement age is constantly being bumped up. So in some ways it is reneging, because earlier you thought that you only had to work till you were 60, but slowly you're seeing that your working life is going up. And then there are other ways in terms of the kinds of, it's not that your pension goes to zero, but there are ways in which it is made lower than what you thought you would get. But just this is a puzzle that it's a question that if government has reneged, and we know that it has, how is it that civil servants don't see it? Because in my experience, I have not come across a single civil servant who says that, what, this might get us into trouble and I don't trust the state and who knows what might happen. And so perhaps let's change this conversation to something where we have, a little bit more funding or a little bit more transparency on where the money is coming from or where it is parked. But somehow that discussion in the class of civil servants just seems absent, or certainly the ones that we speak to are just so confident that this time around it's impossible that the state will not pay us.
So before we get to that question, I want to ask a question that takes a step back. But even before that, I want to take a little digression, and I'll go on a mini rant, because what is life without rants and digressions? You mentioned about how it became almost custom that, oh, so and so is retiring and my promotion de do, higher pension and all that. And this reminds me of Milton Friedman's famous formulation of the different ways to spend your money, 4 ways of spending money, and he had kind of made a table. I'll link it from the show notes. It's quite beautiful, and it depends on, like, you can spend your money or someone else's money, and you can spend it on yourself or someone else. And if you're spending your money on yourself, you obviously economize and you seek the highest value. You don't want to spend too much, but you want value. If you're spending your money on someone else, you economize because you don't want to spend too much money, but you don't seek highest value because you're spending on someone else. You don't really care. If you're spending someone else's money on yourself, you don't economize and you seek highest value, right? Because you don't care about how much, it's not your money, kuch bhi dal do, but you want the value. And if you're spending someone else's money on someone else, then you don't economize and you don't seek highest value. So often I cite this in the context of government spending on the general population, that they're spending someone else's money on someone else and they don't give a shit and they don't economize or spend value. But in this case, they're actually spending someone else's money on themselves because they are the beneficiaries. So they'll seek the highest value and they won't economize, which leads us into this terrible vicious spiral. And my question here, before we go on to the question of why don't civil servants think more about the possibility of reneging, my question here is that in India, if this whole pensions debate applies only to civil servants, one way of thinking about that, in fact, my instinctive way at one point of thinking about that, which is clearly wrong, would have been to say it's a small percentage of people who gives a shit, let them do whatever, as long as they don't interfere with our freedoms. But what you're pointing out is, yes, it's a small percentage of people, but it has an enormous impact on the rest of the country. So I want you to spell that out for me, that why were states reneging? Why were they failures? What are the amounts and percentages involved?
I want to say 2 things. The first is your immediate question. The numbers were pretty large. They were they'd gone up 8, 9, 10, 11% of the government's expenditure and clocking up at a scary rate. There's a very important paper that all of us had worked on in that period. It is authored by Surendra Dave and Gautam Bhardwaj, where household survey data was used to estimate the presence of civil servants and pensioners in the economy, and the NPV of their pension was calculated.
NPV, what's
net
NPV?
present value. So you take the promises going deep into the future, you take into account the present estimates about mortality, and you add up all those future things discounted, probability weighted and discounted into the present. And the calculations used a wrong method, an over optimistic method on the mortality. Okay, so there's a long story. It was a backward looking mortality table because in the future mortality will improve. What the data that was used for that paper was a backward looking mortality table, the mortality experience of India of the last 30 years. In the next 30 years, it'll always be the case that you're going to live longer. And that paper found a very big, important fact. It found that the net present value of the promises to pensioners alone, who are about civil servants alone, who are about 3% of the population, was 68% of GDP
3% of the population getting 68% of GDP.
as the value of the promise. That if you fully funded the promises made to all workers and all pensioners today, what was the size of the fund you would need to pay for all those promises?
Which year was this paper and
This
what was
paper
it? Which time was it measured?
Roughly
2003.
2003-4.
Mm.
Okay, this paper was written in 2003. So we can quibble about the exact methods, and it goes in a couple of different ways. I think the truth is a bit higher because of this forward-looking, backward-looking problem. But any which way you cut it, it was a eye-opener that 3% of the population was grabbing something that was worth 68% of GDP. That's just a no-no. So I don't think anybody would accept that there is an implicit debt, there is an implicit burden upon the Indian state of 68% of GDP on account of this. So I think these two things came together. One was just that year after year strong compound growth of the pension payments. And the second was this evidence about the magnitude of the pension promise to 3% of the workers. These two things came together and created a call for action.
I know. I think there was one more thing, and it's this 3% number. That if only 3% people, and plus if you add the EPFO folks, that's the formal sector, it came to about 12% of the population. And there was a lot of concern that what are we doing for those that are not covered by these pensions? And I think, in this entire NPS reform movement, I think there was a big push on, in fact, it was housed in the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment to begin with. It was not a civil services
So if
question.
3% is going to cost 68%, it's non-scalable. You can't take it to 30% of the population.
That will be
Because
680%
of GDP. So what Renuka is saying is absolutely right. That the thinkers of that period were saying, what institutional arrangements can we create that will work for the population? Then they needed to be profoundly different. And then this brings me back to what you were saying earlier, that it's important to think of dog fooding. Okay, civil servants are that entitled elite getting a very good deal on their pensions, and they are educated, they're sophisticated. So it is only right that a pension reform should start from civil servants. So if you build a new system and it is proven and it works for civil servants, then in good faith, we are able to offer it to everybody else in the country saying, look, we're dog fooding. Civil servants are eating this pension system. So it's also good enough for you. Similarly, I'm jumping subjects. When you had to build a health system in India, the right place to start is CGHS. Okay, imagine we fix CGHS. We actually make it a world-class, sane, sensible health system. And we make it work. It's a significant chunk of people. It is educated, they're sophisticated, and it's a dog fooding. That if this health system is good enough for the civil servant, then surely it's good enough for the population. So I feel these are ways in which you think about the reform process.
Explain the term dog fooding.
Dog fooding is that I'm eating my own the food that I've made myself. It's not dog food. It's not the food that is good enough to be given to my dog. It's food that's good enough for me. It's a phrase.
Wonderful. So, before we start talking about India in particular, it seems to me that, as you alluded to earlier, that we've evolved differently from the rest of the world in the sense that the whole pensions debate is not about the general population, but about the civil service, and that the rest of the world has kind of evolved in different ways. So, to get a sense of how this drama can play out, what can you give me about a global perspective on what is the global experience with pensions, and what directions has it gone?
I think the OECD countries all have population-wide systems of one form or the other. You have some basic pension that the state gives you when you retire. You have some employer-based systems which are also often DB systems.
Are they voluntary or mandated? Like, do employers compete to give good pension schemes, or how
No,
does
I
it
think
work?
that they are, in most cases, they are sort of mandated by the state and everybody contributes. And on top of it, you may do some voluntary additional contributions for yourself. So, in the OECD world, the problem is that when the state is giving money to large parts, to the full population, really, the fiscal consequences are enormous, much more difficult than what we are facing in India. And that's what that world is grappling with. And there has been tons and tons of reform in many countries, and in some countries like France they are not even able to increase the retirement age. So there is a wide sort of spectrum of reform systems and pension programs in these parts of the world, and they are driven by demographic change and fiscal consequences of that demographic change. I think in parts of South Asia and countries like India, the problem is different. I think we are animated both by fiscal concerns on the one hand and complete lack of coverage on the other. So you have large parts of this country who have absolutely no access to a pension and or no access to a pot of wealth when they retire unless they have built it themselves. So there is no help coming or no institutional structure through which they are incentivized to save. So I think that there are these two forces that are pulling at the pensions question in places like India. So I would say that these are the two extremes, really.
In the notes that you made for this, you've quoted Robert Palacios as saying all DB systems have failed or will fail. And you give this intriguing example of Japan, where you point out that in 1940, the elderly were 5% and working age people were 60%, ratio of 12 to 1. So 12 working people supporting one old person. In 2020, that the elderly were 30%, the working age people were 60%. So that's two working people supporting each one. And then it doesn't compute. If you've designed a pension system for that particular 12 to 1 formulation, it breaks down completely when you reach here. So I'm curious about, can you talk about examples of such breakdowns, and how were they tackled by those countries? Because you're dealing with a problem that is far larger than 3%. And also, I can't grok that if 3% in India required 68% of GDP to support them, as the projections went, over their entire populations are being supported. But what is the structure of the pension schemes that made them viable when they were viable? And what are the different things that happened politically and economically when they began to break down?
Defined benefit systems came up in the rich countries because of that late 19th century, early 20th century impulse of using that 12 is to 1 environment, that there are 12 workers and one pensioner. I want to pay the pensioner 50% of the wage. So in a way, I am loading a half worker cost on 12 people. So each of them is paying 1 by 24 of a tax, and I'm transferring it to the one. These things looked seductive in the 19th century and the early 20th century, and they sprang up all over the place. And as longevity changed, these things became a millstone around the neck. These problems have also been extremely destructive in the political system, because you can imagine how wrenching it is that older people organize themselves as a lobby to protect the interests of the older people, and the state and the young want to do something differently. So there has been horrible political conflict in these countries, where countries have literally been torn apart on these problems. At one extreme is the United States, where relatively little has been done. So the United States Social Security and the United States Medicare and Medicaid are deeply bankrupt systems. They are vast implicit debts hanging over the United States government, and God knows how and when the United States will get to solving these problems.
Is it fair to define it by saying that it's basically paying older people by taking money from unborn people?
Every year, so today's young will get money from tomorrow's young, and those tomorrow's young are as yet unborn. The numbers in the United States are that Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid add up to something like 300 to 400% of GDP as a whole in their fiscal accounting. So they are in a very bad mess, and they've done pretty badly in addressing that. At the other extreme, many countries have done a great job. I saw one very sweet element of a solution in Sweden. In Sweden, they wrote a law. So all the political parties fought and came together around a solution. And the solution was a law. Okay, and in that law, they wrote down the principle that the pension system shall always be solvent. Okay, we will not let it go bankrupt. What it requires, what it means is that every year you have to keep cutting the benefit. So that number from 50% has to keep going down every year. The mathematical formula for how that number will be cut down is written into the law. So there you have a law which contains a complicated mathematical formula, and it's coded into the damn law. So every year the pension goes down. That's their way of keeping it solvent.
And interestingly, Sweden seems to adore the old because their most famous pop band was called ABBA.
Yeah.
I mean, I agree with Ajay, and these are called notional defined contribution systems, and they have these complicated ways of arriving at the pension that you will get, and that's based on the average life expectancy of the cohort and the expected interest rate. And so, there is a little bit of uncertainty there because you don't know what you will get, but it's clear that what you will get is based on some very transparent factors,
So it's
such
not
as
guaranteed,
yeah.
meaning there are formulas and it will go down. You are guaranteed that it's going to go down compared to what you see people getting today. So this is one line of attack, that you have to renege on those old promises and you have to let go. And I would say to every Indian civil servant that, would you buy United States government bond? Yes, of course. That is guarantee. Okay. There is nothing better than a 30-year United States government bond. 30 years from now, the damn United States government is going to pay you. But do you want to be receiving a pension from an OECD country? You got to be circumspect. Maybe the government will do it, maybe the government will not do it. And then if there's a pension promise from an Indian government, okay, you are in a much more fragile place as compared to that.
How does that famous quote from Keynes go that there's nothing certain in life except debt, taxes, and US government bonds? Is that how it goes?
Something like that. And certainly not a US government guaranteed pension.
And it seems to me that there's a deep political problem in this as well, in these kind of pensions. So describe the political problem to me.
The political problem is that once you are old or you're near retirement, now you want that damn promise. And the elderly are often politically influential. They are motivated to join hands and form lobbies. So, like in America, there is an AARP, American Association of Retired People, which just endlessly lobbies to extract more resources from society to pay the old.
And in some ways, right, if you have been promised something for 40 years of your life, I see why you are fighting for it today, because you have based your entire life trajectory or your choices on the assumption that this is the money that you are going
I mean,
to
at
get.
the very unseen level, that if you knew the state was going to renege on its pension promises, you could have had more kids. There's a human being who doesn't exist because someone believed a promise.
The second line of attack through which this has been addressed all over the world is to build a completely new concept of pension wealth, which is called a defined contribution system. Okay, and this actually fits nicely into the 2x2 by Friedman that you described. In a defined benefit system, we're all playing with funny money. We're playing with government money. The contributions from the people go into tax revenues, and the tax money is used to pay out pensions. So there is this great blending that's going on, and money is fungible. So some people are paying contributions, some people are paying taxes. That money is all pooled together, money is fungible, and some money goes out to pay pensioners. And it has all the bad incentives because you're using other people's money to pay old people, and then it becomes a political compulsion about which political party wants to cultivate the vote bank of the older people, and it goes pretty badly. Defined contribution pensions is the opposite idea. In a defined contribution pension, it is my money sitting in my account, is my personal wealth, and not a drop of my money will be used to pay for her pension. Okay, so it's an establishment of private property, that each person is given institutional arrangements and some kinds of incentives and even coercion to put money into that pension account all through life. And it earns returns, and that is key to thinking about this. But it's my money, it's my wealth, it's my personal property. And in a good country, there is no First Amendment of the Constitution that takes away property as a fundamental right. So that property is inviolate. Nobody can touch that damn money. It's my money. So I find security and safety in the fact that it's my money, it's my wealth. It's as basic as personal property, that nobody should be able to come to me and snatch my wristwatch like that. Nobody should be able to come to me and touch a paisa out of my money sitting in my pension account. That is security. But how much money you will accumulate, what returns you will earn are unpredictable. And therefore, what flow of annual expenditures you will be able to fund in retirement is not guaranteed. That's a risk you take. So these are the trade-offs. That in a defined benefit pension, it appears you have a guarantee, but the guarantee is actually illusory. In a defined contribution pension, one part is great, that particularly in the advanced economies where property is a fundamental right, where nobody will touch your assets. We can't quite say that in India, but we hope that the people will be mobilized to outrage when somebody tries to touch their property. Then you get a personal pension account which holds that person's wealth for old age. And we are protected from all the vicissitudes of society. What happens to other people, I don't care. It's me, my money. These are the good things about a defined contribution system. But the downside is you actually can't predict precisely what pension you will get in old age.
And like you correctly pointed out, with a little bit of outrage that I detected, that isn't there some paternalism in mandating this defined contribution? Like, there's this great quote by David Bose where he says, conservatives want to be your daddy, telling you what to do and what not to do. Liberals want to be your mommy, feeding you, tucking you in and wiping your nose. Libertarians want to treat you as an adult. Stop quote. And I had a great episode with David Bose as well, which I will link from the show notes. But here, therefore, it seems like both being daddy and mommy. That daddy saying that you have to contribute to your pension, and mommy saying your pension will take care of you.
So it's a very tough question. And in any case, as Renuka will emphasize, most of India has nothing. They have no formal pension arrangements. So, as you know, I am a campaigner around personal finance, and I go around preaching to people that, dude, save more and, put it away in assets that generate better returns in the long run. But I can see the paternalistic case of forcing Amit to save more. And I feel it's a low amount of damage because I'm not actually coercing you to take your money away from you. I'm really not distorting many things about your life. It's your money that will sit in your pension account that will earn a good return. And for the rest, when you become old, you use that money as you like. I feel that's a morally justifiable place.
I think people have often justified this kind of paternalism because we don't want to see poverty in old age. And if you end up destitute in old age, then society will be morally obliged to do something for you. And you will end up with cash transfers or some other interventions by the state so that you are not poor and dying on the streets. And to preclude that possibility, because if you don't save, then you're going to come back to me, the state, for help, and therefore that justifies me pushing you to save some money for your old age.
In each country, you got to ask the question that when the newspaper headlines come along about a former secretary to government who is now destitute in the slums of Dharavi, how much outrage will be generated? And the more that outrage that will be generated because of choices that person made and random events that happened to that person, the more the outrage that will be generated in that society, the greater is the case for this pensions coercion, saying, sorry, all your life I will coerce you to tuck money away into a defined contribution account so that when you retire, you have a chunk of money, of your own money. So I'm neither taking money from you nor am I giving money to you, but I am coercing you to make sure that your money is transported into your old age.
I want to say a little bit more on the defined contribution system because it's as we talk a little bit more about DC systems, there are questions around the design of the fund management of these accumulations that become very important. So in a DB system or in a pay-G system, there is money coming in and there is money going out, and
Renuka, what's a pay-G system?
pay-as-you-go system. Amit mentioned it right at the start. So there's money coming in and there's money going out, and there isn't much thinking that you have to do about the design of this system. But the minute you start doing defined contribution systems and you are starting to have pension funds and that is your property and nobody can touch it, just the way Ajay described, then who is managing that money? How much is that person charging for managing the money? Is the person running away with the money? All of these questions become very important. And then that's where you get into this whole policy thinking around what the best design of that could be. And for example, some of the countries that moved to this kind of a system were Latin American countries. Chile, for example, had made enormous progress in setting up DC systems, but they made multiple mistakes on these questions of design, and the results have not been great, and that gives DC systems a bad name, because lots of money is paid in fees, lots of money is lost, and perhaps we can talk about this later. But I just wanted to bring this up, that saying that this is your property and then there is a fund is just the start of the problem, because that raises multiple problems of its own.
Yeah, and quite apart from those downstream problems, I will still register my protest at the coercion and the paternalism involved. But let's not discuss that further. That's a separate subject entirely. I want to talk about the political problem, because you pointed out that if you have this news that so and so is now living destitute in a slum, and there will be outrage, and what is the consequence of this outrage? The consequence of this outrage is inevitably political pressure. And it seems to me here to come up against this trade-off which is ubiquitous in democratic politics, a trade-off between people want to be taxed less, but people also want to be given more. They want greater payouts. And this is a tussle. And one way of thinking about this is, that public choice theory term, dispersed cost and concentrated benefit. So if you take 1 rupee from every citizen and you give it to one small interest group, they're all making lakhs and crores, and costs are dispersed. Citizens don't really feel that 1%. And that's one way it works. But nevertheless, it seems to me that at some point, something's got to give. Or is it the case that, we get apathetic and we get reconciled to the kind of taxes that we are paying? The peak tax rate under the Indira Gandhi went to 97.5, and taxpayers don't protest enough because they just take it for granted and it's normalized and it creeps up and it's unseen. They don't see what is happening. They imagine we are paying taxes because roads ban rahe hai. But actually, the things that they would approve of being done with their taxes, like rule of law and roads, are minuscule. There's so much wastage that goes on.
But Amit, I think that when you have peak tax rates, you also have peak tax evasion. And so one of the ways in which people deal with this is to have a lot of undeclared income. So it's not as if, there is exit and there is voice, right? There's always two ways of responding to any
and
system.
loyalty,
And yes,
which we see more and more of in these times.
Or not.
But but my question was different. My question is the political pressures. What are the political pressures in democratic politics where technically I would think that there will always be some kind of fine balance or equilibrium maintained, because the taxpayers won't want to get taxed too high and those who are beneficiaries.
So rather than keep this abstract, shall we walk through the Indian journey? And
Yes.
at every step of the way, we will see interesting combinations of ideas, interests, and institutions shaping outcomes. So I think that's where it will become real rather than speaking about it in a more abstract.
Let's do that.
In India, from the 50s, we had this thing called the EPFO, the Employee Provident Fund Organization, that was mandatory for private organizations with more than 20 workers. And of course, we had the old British civil service pension. There was a military pension where, as you know, in the Indian military, most people retire at about 35 or 37, but they still get the 50% pension. So it's very attractive to them because they're going to live for a long, long time. And therefore, the NPV of their pension is particularly high. Okay, so this was the landscape in the 50s. A big milestone, the first piece of changes to the pension system, I'm loath to use the word pension reform because it's actually a de-reform. deform came in 1995. There is a global organization called the ILO, the International Labour Organization. They specialize in walking around into helpless developing countries with low understanding of public policy and planting bad ideas in the field of labor economics. So they came into India. This is the government of Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh, where frankly people knew very little about labor economics and pension arrangements and all that. And a remarkable new scheme was introduced called EPS, Employee Pension Scheme, which was the first defined benefit scheme for employees of private firms. Okay. And in the light of all the scary stuff that we've discussed for the last 1 hour, I think you will be amused to know that this is a scheme that was bankrupt on the day that it was announced. It was just based on wrong calculations. It was based on wrong policy analysis. And as you know, I've talked a lot at length about the difficulties of Indian public policy. There was just a lack of knowledge in India at that time. So in some ways, you would think that Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh and the Ministry of Finance team of the time would have had significant knowledge, that they would have been able to withstand the visit of an ILO team, but they weren't. And one more bad brick of the Indian pension system came about. And the moment these things are done, then it's very hard to undo them. Until today, the EPS is there as a defined benefit thing paid by the government to every employee of a private firm, now with more than 10 people. Okay, so these are EPS is 10 or 20. EPS is 20. Okay, so these are dangerous things that have been happening. That brings us to the late 90s. In the late 90s, two things were going on. One is that there was a scary acceleration of the annual pension spend. The second is that in an obscure piece of the Indian state called the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment. In the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment, there were two remarkable people called Anand Bordia and Ashok Pal Singh, and their minister was Menka Gandhi. Okay, they started thinking and worrying about old people in India being destitute. And they knew the arithmetic. They figured out the arithmetic that if you just apply the Indian style population multiplied by some fraction of older people, it's turning into a mess. They were running some subsidy programs, gifting 100 rupees a month or 200 rupees a month to old people, but they knew that's spitting in the wind. That doesn't do anything. So they started understanding that there is a big problem brewing, and it needs a deeper and more fundamental resolution in terms of the development of pension institutions in India. At the time, Jim Hansen in the World Bank and Sanjay Kathuria in the World Bank were organizing a conference in Goa on the Indian financial system. And Anand Bodia was there in the conference. I was there in that conference. And I had worked on pensions in the United States context at the RAND Corporation when I was a PhD student. So I knew a little bit about United States Social Security and how bankrupt it was and so on. And there was almost a chance encounter in the corridor, but little more than that. Shankaracharya, who was then the chief economic advisor, got Anand Bordia and me together. And he said to Anand Bordia, you want to build a pension system in India, you need this guy because he understands finance. Okay, and that's how Anand Bordia and I started talking. And there was a very interesting formal structure that was adopted. There's a person named Gautam Bhardwaj, who at the time was running an organization called Invest India Economic Foundation. And the arrangement was that private philanthropy supported Invest India Economic Foundation, and Invest India Economic Foundation started doing pensions research for the Ministry of Social Justice. And they became a critical meeting point where research papers started being commissioned and meetings started being put together and so on. And then the government set up a committee which is called the OASIS Committee. OASIS stands for Old Age, Social and Income Security. It's just a cute acronym. The OASIS Committee was headed by Surendra Dave, who at the time I think had just stepped down as chairman of UTI, but he was a PhD economics person who had lived his life in the financial system. So he got finance, and the head of the EPFO was a member, and I was a member, and there were a couple of other members. And Project Oasis tried to do first principles thinking on how do we want to think about pension arrangements. Okay, Renuka alluded to the frictions and the difficulties of a fund management system. And we were lucky that because we were doing this in the late 90s, by that time we had access to the knowledge and experience of what are called the first generation pension reforms, which are really UK, Latin America, a couple of other countries, where it was basically clear that the frictions, the overheads, and the charges of the fund managers was killing the accumulation. On one hand, putting assets to work through a private fund management system is pretty fantastic because equities earn a good rate of return. Okay, so if there is a simple mantra for what people should be investing their assets in, it is globally diversified equities. Okay, Renuka will talk more about the importance of globally diversified. She has important work on that subject. But equities have that higher rate of return. And there are fluctuations, there is risk. That risk never goes away. But on average, equities generate a higher return. So there is a power of compounding. When you take a somewhat higher return and you play it out for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, it adds up to a lot of money. So the opportunity for a defined contribution system is critically linked to equity investment. That you want to salt away money every year from age 16 or 20 or whatever, whenever a person joins the labor force. And you want to earn that multi-decade equity rates of return of that money. But at the same time, you don't want a lot of that money to be burnt up in paying financial firms, and there are various frictions along the way. So Project Oasis applied its mind to this problem of how to do a better pension system reform that is consistent with Indian style numbers. So we used to always do the calculation that in the late 90s, the contribution number we wanted to work with was 10 rupees per day. That we wanted to be able to efficiently move 10 rupees per day from a individual. And so it could be anybody in the economy. We wanted to move 10 rupees per day from that person to efficient, frictionless, scale fund managers who would get exposure to equities. And this would go on for 20, 30, 40, 50 years and generate strong rates of return. And so there were some really good innovations in that pension system design that we did as Project Oasis in the late 90s. The report was 1999. I'm very pleased to say that actually by world standards, it was one of the first reports that understood many elements of that solution. So I was young, I was new to this game. Surendra Dave basically challenged me to think big and bring knowledge of institutional design, of index funds, of computer-based systems to be able to reduce the friction and take away the operational costs of these systems. And it was really amazing how he was a much older person, but he knew how to challenge me. He knew how to push me to solve the problems. Left to myself, I would have been too shy. I would have been timid. But he was able to push me to say, no, that's not acceptable. That's not acceptable. And so we kept coming up with a better and better design. And that was Project Oasis 1999, just a report. Okay, this was a report given over to Menka Gandhi, who was the Minister for Social Justice. Anand Bodia and Ashok Pal Singh and Menka Gandhi rapidly understood that this was beyond their pay grade, that small little Ministry of Social Justice could not build pension institutions on the scale of a country because we're dealing with something truly gigantic. And, you know, what we had designed as Oasis was not just a civil service pension. It was a population scale pension system that would work for everybody. Remember, I said 10 rupees a day of contribution. That was the minimum number. So our worldview in 1999 money was that for the people who can contribute 10 rupees a day, you're running and you can meaningfully build pension assets. And we had done nice simulation studies. Susan had written a paper about how equity investment translates to meaningful numbers when you start at 10 rupees per day. Below 10 rupees a day of contribution, we said that's a problem of welfare systems. That there you have to do anti-poverty programs and gift them money from the exchequer. So that's a zone where pensions cannot help. So we cannot solve the problem of poverty. But by the time you get to that minimum number of a contribution rate of 10 rupees a day, 300 rupees a month, then it was proving to be meaningful that we can move this money through a pension system for 20, 30, 40, 50 years and turn it into something material that will make a difference to the old age financial situation of the people. But it's a population scale story, not just a civil servant story, not just an EPFO story. So yeah, we were interested in solving the civil service pension. We were interested in solving the EPFO, but we were most interested in solving the 85% of India that had nothing. And that was a design that was offered, Project Oasis. But that report was clearly beyond the implementation capability of the Ministry of Social Justice. So in 2000, Menka Gandhi went over to meet Yashwant Sinha, who was the finance minister, and handed over this report and said that, unusual as it is for a government person to not seek or desire turf, I am exiting this problem because it is beyond my pay grade. Only Ministry of Finance can do it. Here's the report. Now you guys do it, and I will support you in cabinet every step of the way. So it was a remarkable act by her that she didn't try to seek the glory and try to grab turf and go back to the cabinet and say, we have done this work and social justice should build this pension system, which would have been very good for the officials and the career of the people in Ministry of Social Justice and of Menka Gandhi. Instead, she did a very selfless thing. She went to Yashwant Sinha. She said, only Ministry of Finance can do this. And so here, I'm giving you this report. I'm giving you my good wishes. I'm giving you my blessings. And whenever there is a battle, count on me. And I will appear in the cabinet and I will support you to the hilt. But for the rest, you guys have to do this. Okay, so that's how it moved to Ministry of Finance. And it just so happened that there are accidents in all these things. And in 2001, I was hired into the Ministry of Finance. So it was an accident that this report was being processed in the Ministry of Finance. And even though I had no idea that these things would come together, in 2001, I ended up joining the Ministry of Finance.
So you're the co-author of the report, who is now one of the people who is going to decide what to do with this report.
Well, being a bit player in the implementation team. So nothing much happened for a while. And then the turning point of this work was when S. Narayan became the finance secretary in the DEA. When S. Narayan became the finance secretary, he sat me down and he said, I'm trying to remember the exact number. He said something like, I have 253 days on this job. So what are the battles that are worth picking? Okay, so on his first day, he sat me down and he said, I have 253 days in this job. So let's think about what are the priorities. And I spent several days with him talking through many fields. And he had to pick and choose a few things. And remarkably enough, he chose pensions as one thing. He said, look, this is very big. It's very difficult, but let me knock on doors. Let me try. Okay. So step one, he went to the finance minister, Jaswant Singh. I was not in the room, but I've heard stories from S. Narayan about what happened in that room. And what happened was absolutely remarkable. Jaswant Singh was one of those great ministers of this country. He always thought about things on a strategic scale. He always thought for 25 years. He always thought for 50 years. He understood this in a flash, that the old pension arrangement is strangling the Indian state. The projections of those high growth rates of pension payments was going to create a fiscal disaster for the Indian state. And you needed a long-term solution which would work not just for civil servants, but it would work for the entire economy. And he said, this is first order. This is fundamental. If we don't fix this, we're going to destroy the entire public finance of India. We're setting ourselves for a horrendous political conflict because one by one, we'll start reneging on these promises. And so this is a big one. We're going to fight it, even though it's going to be very unpopular with those 3% or with the EPFO. That we are going to fight this. Jaswant Singh and S. Narayan took this to the other big two of that NDA cabinet, Advani and Vajpayee. Once again, I was not in the room, but I heard stories from them that by and large, they all coalesced around this philosophy that this is going to be unpleasant. We are only going to suffer some political pain for doing this. But it is so big, it is so important that we can't leave this aside. And they saw the graphs, they saw the explosive growth of pension payments in that period, and things that can't go on won't. And so the big three of the cabinet came together and decided that this is a reform that we're going to do. At the time, UK Sinha was the Joint Secretary in the DEA handling this subject. Technically, he was Joint Secretary Capital Markets, which is a bit of a misnomer. Traditionally, the JS Capital Markets has run a lot of the more intellectual work happening in the DEA. So somehow this landed up as UK Sinha's work. And so UK Sinha and I had this amazing opportunity of being the support crew around these meetings taking place between the big three of the cabinet. And they increasingly came to the decision that we're going to do this. So what was the idea of the reform? The idea of the reform was that we will not renege on promises made to the people who are workers as of today. So you're standing in 2003 and there are people who've been recruited in 2002. At the point of recruitment, a civil servant signs a contract. In that contract, there is a list of terms and conditions and promises. And they said, we will not renege on those. What we will do is we will change the terms and conditions of the future recruits. So the pension reform will be phased in from the future. Okay, so that's much easier, that you're not getting into a great war with the present workers or the present pensioners saying that we'd like to give you less pension than as compared with what we had originally promised you. But we're talking to new recruits, and the new recruits get the choice clearly. Do you want to become a civil servant or not? If you don't like the pension promise, don't become a civil servant. But once you sign the contract, you've signed a new contract, and it's a consenting adult who signed the contract. So the plan became that we will phase in a new pension system from the 1st of Jan 2004, that every new recruit from 1st of Jan 2004 onwards will be put into the new pension system, which was designed by Project Oasis. And again, I was not in the room, but there were many discussions between Vajpayee and the other cabinet members and UK Sinha around calculations. So it coalesced around the following numbers. So imagine that there's a civil servant getting a wage of 100. Then imagine that we knock out 10 rupees, we take out 10 rupees from that 100, and that goes as a contribution into the pension account. And we give that person a 10 rupee raise, and that new 10 rupees also goes into the pension account. Okay, so we're taking away the old pension system. We're giving a 10% raise. The wage goes from 100 to 110, but we're taking 20 rupees of the 110 and forcibly putting it as a personal wealth of the individual inside that person's pension account. And it's fascinating that Mr. Vajpayee asked for many, many calculations of alternative ways to rejig these numbers. And I did all those calculations of doing simulations into the future, understanding what equities will do, equity investment, compounding with alternative numerical values. And finally, 10 and 10 came to the simulations and projections where the political genius of Atal Bihari Vajpayee felt comfortable that I think this is a good deal, that we're taking away the old pension, but it's a 10% raise, and we're taking away 20 and we're putting it into a pension account, and that 20 grows so well with compounding that, all in all, you're square, that this is going well, it's a good deal, and everybody should be happy. Okay, so this was the story of the pension system. So I think on the 12th of December 2002, Vajpayee signed the file, and the decision was taken that there will be this new design of the new pension system, which is basically the design of the Dave committee of the Project Oasis. This will be implemented, and that entire architecture of fund managers and mechanisms of moving money, of creating individual accounts. Renuka emphasized, how do I make sure that the money doesn't vanish? How do I ensure that the fees and expenses of all the financial players does not suck away the accumulation? All these things had been thought about and designed. And from 1/1/2004, all new recruits of the Indian state would be put into this new pension system. Now, I want to tell some little stories. So, first was state governments. This was put on offer to the state governments because, the union government has no right to force anybody when it comes to the state government. Each state government is its own decision making unit. But state governments were very receptive. They also knew, they also got this cold that this stuff is unaffordable. Like exactly as the union government was understanding that there is a pension crisis, state governments also fully understood that there is a pension crisis. So UK Sinha and then KP Krishnan, who were the Joint Secretary Capital Markets, they engaged with all the state governments, ran many meetings. And I think apart from West Bengal and Kerala, I don't remember whether Kerala came in later, but West Bengal probably didn't come in. All the states agreed that this is a good idea and we are also moving. There was quite a battle and a complicated problem of understanding every single organization of the union government that has employees who are entitled to the old pension system. This is a Herculean battle. It's very difficult to get that list. Okay, Government of India is a shambolic mess. Nobody knows what organizations are where, what is the list of people who are workers, what is the list of people who are pensioners. You'll be astonished at the bad state of data. But all this hard work started happening of assembling the list of all organizations where there is an employee who is entitled to the old pension system. For example, consider Bombay Port Trust. Okay. Is Bombay Port Trust a government organization? Does Bombay Port Trust have employees who are entitled to the old pension system? And if they are, then yes, they are covered by the 12th December 2002 cabinet resolution. Okay, so this is the kind of large-scale complex work that began in laying the groundwork for the implementation. Okay, now all this landed into a new set of questions when the UPA won power in 2004. So on one hand, this decision was taken on the 12th of December 2002. On the other hand, the NDA lost power and there was a new government in 2004. And all these questions were reopened as they should. That new government was going to apply its mind to these questions. There were two kinds of challenges. One kind of challenge was that should there be an NPS at all? Should we just stick with the OPS? Okay. And the second was that do we really want to go build this new NPS architecture, or should we just give it to IRDA and the existing insurance companies? And the insurance companies vigorously lobbied for this. They really wanted it and they put significant effort into that lobbying. The strategic idea that I feel we should be very careful about is that this defined contribution system is a fund management play. Once it becomes an insurance thing, it is too tempting for insurance companies to propose a defined benefit product because that's an actuarial thing. It comes naturally to the way an insurance company thinks. So it is better to keep these two things separate because you run the risk of some DB creeping back as long as there are insurance companies in it. Just to clarify, in every defined contribution system, through the working life, a person is accumulating pension wealth. Okay, then at the end of that, it should be the choice of that person about whether to buy an annuity. An annuity is a product where you put down 100 rupees and then you get some monthly pension until you die. That is produced by an insurance company. But the rest of it is a fund management story. And so we wanted to protect that intellectual clarity. And so we felt it's better to separate this out of insurance companies and IRDA. So there was quite a lobbying push by the insurance companies at the time. So these were the two questions that were evaluated by P. Chidambaram, by Rahul Gandhi, by the UPA cabinet, and the decisions were taken that we fully agree and endorse the NPS design and we will go through with the NPS. So that was a less polarized age. So the fact that these decisions had been made by a BJP government did not interfere and the story was to go on. These were the political decisions of the new UPA government.
Ajay, but while they did not roll back the NPS for a long time, they did not move ahead with the design of the NPS as was envisaged either. For example, the PFRDA Act was not passed for a long time. For a long time, the money was not given to pension fund managers because they were not licensed, and it stayed in the old sort of Sarkari fund management system where they just got this 8% return because, or around 8% because EPFO was giving the same. So I think that it was not a smooth transition.
So let me describe that mess. At the level of P. Chidambaram, Minister of Finance, and the cabinet, there was a decision that we are doing this. The UPA one ran into trouble because the CPIM was a critical partner to the coalition, and the CPIM was opposed to the new pension system. So there was quite a standoff. The UPA was not keen to turn this into a make or break fight. So there was an interesting halfway strategy that was developed through which you can make progress. Okay, so let me describe the subtleties of those steps, because actually they give great insight into how to do public policy and also the precise details of what a pension system contributes. So one of India's great constitutional lawyers, bracket Mr. Chidambaram, figured out the whole legal strategy as follows. Step one, you are a new employee. There are terms and conditions of your employment. It is the full power of the union government to amend those terms and conditions as applicable for a new employee. You don't need to go back to the parliament to do that. And they went ahead and they did that. So that's part one, that the promise of a DB pension was removed for all employees after 1/1/2004 as was planned. Okay, so that's piece one, that's done. Now you come to the problem of the record keeping agency and the fund manager and a variety of other service providers that are required in the NPS. Instead of thinking like there will be a regulator who will demand certain behavior and performance out of those persons, the strategy taken at the Ministry of Finance was that for each of these persons, a legal contract was written. And in the contract, the burden of regulatory requirements was placed upon those persons. So you wrote a contract with a fund manager. In a way, the fund manager was then not a regulated person. There was no regulator. But certain burdens were placed upon that fund manager through contract. So there was a contract with the fund manager. There was a contract with the record keeping agency. And that is how the pieces of the NPS architecture started coming about. As Renuka correctly says, it was a bit in limbo. It was limping along. It was not perfect, but it did happen and it did get going. And anyway, many years were wasted on that Herculean journey of finding everybody who was recruited after 1/1/2004 and giving them account numbers, doing the account opening and wiring the piping of their monthly pension flows. So this was the early journey of the NPS. These things were solved late in UPA 2, where the CPIM was not essential to the government. So they went ahead and they enacted the PFRDA Act. The PFRDA stands for the Pension Fund Regulatory and Development Authority. And so that was created by law. And that law created the regulatory structures for the pieces of the new pension system. But the NPS was up and running for all new recruits after 1/1/2004. So this is the story of the NPS, starting from Anand Bordia and Menka Gandhi all the way to the creation of the PFRDA through a parliamentary law in 2012.
Couple of things I have to say. One is, from what I can make out, I love the fact that the design of this is based so much on voluntary action in terms of there's no coercion. You keep your promises to old recruits. New recruits are told, here's the contract. You want to sign it, sign it. Don't sign it, don't sign it. Obviously, everyone signs it. And again, fund managers and all that. It's not regulation. It's contracts. And I sort of love that aspect of it. And the other part of it, which makes me actually a little emotional, is that you have all these people from different parties, right from Maneka Gandhi to, people like Jaswant Singh, Vajpayee, Advani, and later on, Chidambaram, Manmohan, and so on, who are talking to each other and acting in the public interest, and who are taking the long view. And it's so beautiful, and it's so missing today. It's really sad.
And also at the staff level, there were no purges. So there was complete intellectual and bureaucratic continuity. All the people who had worked on the NPS in the NDA one were the people who continued to be working on the NPS in the UPA one.
So you
So there
worked
was
with
full
NDA.
continuity, and the institutional memory was not lost. The intellectual capital was not lost.
You worked with NDA one. You worked with UPA one. Fascinating. So let's take a quick commercial break, and at the other end of the break, we shall go deeper into what happened 2004 onwards. Have you always wanted to be a writer but never quite gotten down to it? Well, I'd love to help you. Since April 2020, I've enjoyed teaching 27 cohorts of my online course, The Art of Clear Writing, and an online community has now sprung up of all my past students. We have workshops, a newsletter to showcase the work of students, and vibrant community interaction. In the course itself, through 4 webinars spread over 4 weekends, I share all I know about the craft and practice of clear writing. There are many exercises, much interaction, and a lovely and lively community at the end of it. The course costs rupees 10,000 plus GST, or about $150. If you're interested, head on over to register at indiauncut.com/clearwriting. That's indiauncut.com/clearwriting. Being a good writer doesn't require God-given talent, just the willingness to work hard and a clear idea of what you need to do to refine your skills. I can help you. Welcome back to the Scene and the Unseen. I'm chatting with Ajay, Shah and Renuka, Sane, and we're talking about pensions. And at the break, Ajay said, the happy part is over. Now it's all downhill from here. It gets sad and despondent, and the wailing of the dispossessed or the mewing of a kitten will attend the rest of our conversation. However, before we get there, you have a story for us, Ajay, which actually belongs to the earlier, happier half. But let's begin this half with it.
When the UPA 1 government came to power, they were puzzling over these questions. Of course, there were lefty people attacking the new pension system, saying that the promise of pensions is being taken away and it's being replaced by a defined contribution system. So I remember one little episode. Bibek Debroy was at the Rajiv Gandhi Institute for Contemporary Studies, and he pulled together a group of younger Congress MPs led by Rahul Gandhi, and I spent a few hours with them doing something like this from scratch, the first principles reasoning about where we are and what are the problems of the old pension system and how the new pension system is the right answer to these problems. And I hope that was part of their thought process and the decision in the Congress to go through with the NPS reform. And similarly, there was a very interesting moment around the insurance companies. I had emphasized that the insurance companies and IRDA were very keen to take this under their fold because it gives them more business. And as I said, there is a very special temptation for an insurance company to push DB, because insurance companies have the unique ability to do DB, whereas fund management is a more commoditized industry and insurance companies have no special value add in doing fund management. In fact, there are other organizations in the country that do well at fund management. So I remember there was a meeting organized by P. Chidambaram where he invited Surendra Dave and the CEOs of all the insurance companies. So at the time, there were some 12 or 13 insurance companies. And I was just a spectator, but these are amazing stories about how these debates took place in that period. And Mr. Chidambaram asked each of the insurance company CEOs to speak for 10 minutes. So I seem to remember there were 13 persons. So for 130 minutes, they all made interesting points about why the NPS should just be done by the existing insurance companies and IRDA, and there was no need to build any separate machinery. And at the end of that, he asked Surendra Dave that how would you respond to this? And Surendra Dave did a brilliant, short 15-minute response explaining why it made sense to have NPS as standing distinct from the insurance companies. The meeting ended. we all went home, and the next day I heard that Chidambaram made up his mind that it was going to be separate. So these were the little milestones, and you know, very high drama for me in those days. But these were the milestones about how these things got done.
Marvelous. Let's go to the sad part of the story now. What is the sad part? Why is it sad? Where do we begin?
We could just begin from 2004 itself, or from when you have this new government coming in. There is a delay in the sort of full scale implementation of the NPS, because for a long time there is no PFRDA Act, and there are fund managers, but there are multiple rules, or the way the system functioned right from the outset deviated from the principles that Project Oasis had laid out.
What is the PFRDA Act?
It's the pension fund regulator that regulates the various
So to make
service.
this happen, you needed to bring the regulator into being with an act.
Exactly, right? But even before that, there was a certain vision of the Project Oasis report, which had various elements of the pension system. They had fund managers, and then there was a record keeping agency, and there was supposed to be annuity service providers. There was a vision around all citizens of the country being able to access the NPS. And I think, Ajay didn't say too much about that, but I thought that that was a beautiful feature of the design, that not only civil servants, but anybody in the country could open a pension account in the NPS. And then once you were in, the choice of the fund managers was the same. So whether you worked in government or you worked outside of government, you could choose the same fund managers. And that brings government employees and non-government employees on a similar footing, accessing the same systems in a way that has not happened before in the country. It also brings economies of scale for the fund managers. But unfortunately, this did not happen. So the government employees were always kept separate. The rules around how they access the NPS, the funds that were, that they could invest in, were always kept separate from this NPS citizen model, so to speak. And every year you had these sort of new, this is a corporate model, and then this is an NPS citizen model, and then this is an NPS government model. And so we kept bringing in wedges into the way that the NPS was supposed to work. Similarly, for a long time, government employees were not allowed to invest their money in private fund managers. So earlier, it was, the idea was that fund managers would come in. There would be an auction-based system so that fund managers would get a license to manage the money. And then it was your choice which fund manager you wanted to direct your contributions to. And for government employees, they would come from the government system. You would indicate that I like fund manager A versus fund manager B.
How many were there?
There were supposed to be 6 in the beginning, and then there were 3 public sector fund managers like LIC, SBI, and UTI, and there were 3 others that were private. But government employees were not allowed to put money into the private ones. They were only putting money in the public ones. There were rules around investment choice. So one of the feature of, or the vision of the NPS was that you could choose the fund that you wanted to invest in. That did not happen for government employees for a long time, because your money was divided equally into the 3 funds, or sometimes the lowest cost fund got bulk of the money and things like that. So right from the outset, there was a vision of the NPS of being this seamless system where anybody could go in, anybody could choose the fund manager, anybody could invest, and government and non-government would be part of this. But that never came to be. So I think that was one design. So it just never took off the way it was meant to take off. The other part of the system that we alluded to was the fact that we would not have high fees, or we would have index funds, so that the fees of the fund managers are kept lower. But I think that increasingly there has been pressure that you change these fundamental elements of the NPS. So now you do a little bit of active management, which increases the fees, and things like that. So that has also diluted the way the NPS was supposed to have been functioning, and that's a little bit of a mess, in my opinion. I think the third thing that happened was this emphasis on informal sector pensions. And I think, again, we spoke about how one of the motivations for the NPS was that a large part of the Indian workforce did not have access to any formal mechanism. And NPS was supposed to be that mechanism whereby at least those who could save, let's say, 10 rupees a day could access the same channels and put their money in. But of course, you can't access a bank because the transactions cost of moving money from a bank to the fund manager would be much higher. And there would be different models or different aggregators or different agents who could go and collect that money and then put that money into the NPS and so on and so forth. But there again, I think that it never really caught on. We started with the NPS Swavalamban scheme, which was a co-contribution scheme where for every 100 rupees that an informal sector worker put in as an incentive, the government would put in another 100. And for 3 years, you would get this co-contribution and this money would grow. But in a span of 3 years in 2015, they shut down the NPS Swavalamban scheme and started a new scheme called the Atal Pension Yojana, which is like a mixture of a defined contribution and defined benefit scheme, wherein you put in some money today and we guarantee that you will get this pension in 20 years' time, 30 years' time, or whatever it is. And there is a whole schedule of contribution and payment. I think that brings uncertainty to the system because you've started on one thing and abruptly you have now gone into something else. So I think, and because of that, there has been a lot of emphasis on increasing coverage. I think that emphasis is a little misplaced because until you get the fundamental features of the system right, it doesn't make sense to keep harping on expanding coverage. And there were many of these things in the NPS that were broken. Like I said, fund management, and we didn't solve for them. Then similarly, there were issues around how money from government was not reaching the CRA, the Central Record Keeping Agency, and then the pension fund managers on time. Now, that's a huge problem. So you have this constituency of government employees who are now part of this system. And what they are finding is that their money is not reaching on time. And there are some CAG reports that show that this is not happening. I think that this is a fundamental problem and should have woken up the PFRDA to say, look, this is the most important thing that we have to focus on, that we have to get this system right for the big chunk of contributors that are there to this system. My sense is that it was not taken as seriously as it should. And of course, that brings in discontent for the government employees. I think the other big problem that happened was that this was such a big shift from an old world where you got a 50% pension of your last wage to a system where there are these fund managers, there is no guarantee on the pension, who knows what they are going to invest in, and as a government employee who has not been adequately informed about what the hell is going on, I think it makes people very nervous about what they have been put into. And again, when the NPS was designed and at the outset, I think that there was consensus that we will do a lot of work on education and just information dissemination so that employees know what they are getting into and what they might be getting out of. So every year you should get some, balance statement. Every year you could get some simulations around what the trajectory of your accumulations would be like. And I think that, again, there was a little bit of a failure where this kind of dissemination never really happened.
And you mentioned that like one of the fundamental points that you disagreed with is that there isn't a common pool of fund managers everybody can choose from. That if you're a government servant, you've just got three, and I think LIC was one of them, and the other two were also government.
Yes, they were PSUs.
They were PSUs, in which case the incentives for the PSUs would have been absolutely horrible. I'd expect the performance to be worse than the private guys. And was that the case? Is that, because then I can, as a government employee, I can totally imagine distrusting that. I would say I'd rather put my money in an index fund because I know that will grow.
No, I think that it wasn't so bad because the investment guidelines of the PFRDA were such that you couldn't really do too much creative fund management. And again, because it was an auction-based system which had decided that this would be the fee that you could charge, in some ways that there wasn't much of a performance differential between the fund managers. But at the same time, what is the incentive for the fund manager if, for the first many years only the PSU funds are going to get the government money, because really the bulk of the accumulations or the contributions would come from those that are part of the mandatory system. Another important feature of the NPS was that fund management was separated from collections. So very often when you invest in something, the people who are taking the money from you and paying the transactions cost of taking the money from you are also the people investing the money and then charging you an asset management fee for investing the money. What NPS did was it separated these two. It said that there is a whole host of organizations that are called points of presence, and they will go and collect your money and they will charge you some sort of a transaction fee. And then there are these fund managers who are going to invest the money and get an asset management fee for the same. Again, there was a lot of pressure so that fund managers could also do sales and marketing, because a bulk of the cost of fund management or where contributions get eaten up is really sales and marketing. And to a large extent, I think NPS has done well on that, where it's still not full-fledged sales and marketing the way that you see in the insurance and the mutual fund sectors. But on the flip side, fund managers would argue that this is what stops them from selling the NPS to a wider pool of people.
And I thought it's so ironic to call, the new scheme in 2014 the Atal Pension Yojana, because I imagined from the story that Ajay told that Atal himself would have disapproved of something like this, given the thought that he had himself given to it, under the guidance of his teammates. So you've spoken about how there was sort of an optimal design that you guys had come up with, and then it becomes something else. And part of an optimal design of a policy not actually being implemented is a messy act of compromise where you're dealing with different stakeholders and interest groups and whatever, and you're coming up with something, and you don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good. So what is there is still worthwhile. But do I get a sort of a sense here that it wasn't just that? It wasn't just that in certain fundamental ways, like the fact that you can't choose your fund manager as a government servant seems like a really fundamental flaw to me, because I'd want the maximum choice. So is it then the case that that there were compromises that weren't necessary? If so, why did they happen? And what were the big flaws in the way this was going forward?
My sense is that the appointments to the PFRDA and the folks making the decisions were not entirely invested in the idea of the NPS itself. And that's my speculation, that you appointed people from the old world who came from a pre-NPS world and perhaps did not buy into the philosophy of the NPS itself. I think that was part of the problem, and that less attention was paid to these questions that were bubbling up and figuring out how to solve them. I feel that much more attention got diverted to the question of coverage, to improving coverage and getting the informal sector into the pensions fold, and less attention was paid to these mandatory folks who are already in the system, potentially disgruntled because they don't understand the system, their money is not reaching the system, and dealing with those problems. Another thing that happened was, I think there was hasty implementation by the state government. So to give you an example, NPS will give you a reasonable benefit if you stay in the system for, let's say, 30, 40 years of your working life. That's where the power of compounding works. And that's where you will accumulate a reasonable corpus that you can annuitize and get some pension. Now, if you are already 40 years old or 45 years old, and then you get thrown into the NPS because you are, you were earlier a contractual employee and then you got made permanent and therefore now you are part of the NPS, then you don't have that much time actually to accumulate that money. And therefore, at the time of retirement, your accumulation is not going to buy you a big annuity. And of course, you're going to be very unhappy because all your peers who are part of the OPS, because when they were 25, it was the OPS. You ended up joining government when it was, you were 40 or 45, and you've not had the time to reap the benefits of the NPS. I think that these decisions could, or these should have been recognized, and there are easy fixes to some of these problems, but they were not done. And I wonder, I think that's sort of myopic thinking on the part of people who were making these decisions at the time.
I want to add two things to this. It sounds like arcane bureaucratic detail, but there was one very important milestone. The subject of pensions moved out from the Department of Economic Affairs to the Department of Financial Services, DFS, within the Ministry of Finance, I think in 2007 or 2008. And that was actually quite a rupture because the institutional memory was all in DEA and in external research organizations that were well integrated with DEA. At the point that it moved to DFS, there was a loss of momentum, there was a loss of institutional memory. Carrying forward where Renuka was right now, I remember once I was invited by the government of Karnataka to spend a day with trade union leaders in Karnataka. It's a while ago, to discuss their criticism and complaints about the NPS. And I was a private citizen, but I did this. And actually, a lot of their practical anecdotes and complaints were solvable, meaning either they were just factually wrong, or as Renuka described, there were corner cases which were really not economically material, but there were individuals stuck in those special situations and that needed solutions. So there was a need of responses, of addressing those corners. And it required that combination of understanding the principles and the foundations of the NPS and being responsive and facing unhappy users and diagnosing sometimes that it's just that there is an ideological divide. You want to dump costs on the people. Sorry, there is no deal there. Sometimes you're factually wrong or you're conceptually wrong, and there is room for facts and evidence and arguments. And sometimes that there is a genuine case where the NPS as designed is doing a bad job and is being unfair to a person, and that needs to be addressed. But that kind of care in diagnosing these bug reports and addressing them, somehow there was a loss of momentum in doing that.
So I think of, in the entire narrative, especially your narrative before the break, Ajay, I see this tremendous creative energy from this bunch of people who in a purposive way they're doing something, whether it is the specialists within the ministry who are working on Project Oasis and whatever, or whether it is the politicians who get the big picture, like you said, Jaswant Singh being extraordinary in that he's taking a strategic view, a 20-25 years view. And seems to me that momentum is affected by two things. And the first is the shift from the DEA to the other department within that, and the institutional memory being lost. So whereas for someone like you it would have been a labor of love, for someone else who is taking over it's a job to be done well perhaps, but not quite a labor of love. But the other shift is of political time horizons. Like a politician's time horizon is always till the next election, whether it's 5 years or whether it's even much sooner because of the next local election or whatever. And therefore there is the curse of short-termism, which is a danger that is looming. And it seems to me to be a really happy accident that there are politicians who can take the longer view, but the typical politician will take the shorter view, especially if that task of getting to the top has been a long, hard slog that has lasted decades. And what I see since 2014, my persistent complaint is that that short-termism is more and more reflected, whereas there is a sense that governance doesn't matter as much as narratives. Narratives matter. And Renuka, what he was saying about coverage, the focus on expanding coverage rather than fixing how the system works, is exactly what I would expect from a short-termism that privileges narrative over actual governance or how it actually works. So, would that be an accurate assessment?
Yeah, maybe. Also, there is a lot of pressure from how India looks in various international comparisons on the question of coverage, and I feel that animates a lot of discussions. And I kind of feel that is the wrong metric to focus on. For example, as I had said earlier, the question of pensions really is a question of how much accumulation you will have at the time you retire, and then what are the products that you will use to draw down that wealth, because you don't know how long you are going to live. And in some ways, at the stage that we are in, it makes me question now whether that accumulation of wealth should be focused only on a product called a pension. Because really, what you want is accumulation of wealth. What you want is people to save and get to a point where they can buy a drawdown product. And somewhere in this desire to look good in reports that show that we have very poor coverage, this was lost. I think that's big part of the problem.
A digressive question, and I'll again slip back to something larger and then I'll come get down in the weeds again with you, is that it seems to me that if you want to have savings or if you want to have some kind of security when you're retired and when you're old, there are different instruments for doing that. One instrument could be whatever the pension scheme is, another instrument could be children. Another instrument could be just saving much more from your private income. And in some of them, I think it would be wrong for the state to adopt coercive measures or to direct from the top down what you should do. Like how many kids should you have, for example, to dictate to poor people, no, you must have minimum 4 kids, you'll be safe after your retirement. It would be absurd and dystopian. But at the same time, we look at another instrument and we say, okay, we'll pretend from the top down that we know how to do this and etc etc. And I understand that a lot of the design of what you've spoken about is all voluntary. People are taking voluntary actions. They can choose a fund manager, they can choose whether to invest or not, and that's fantastic. But in general, at a higher principled, is that something that becomes a factor in this, whereas there is a danger that policy people in the weeds may just be thinking about how can we make this work optimally rather than these sort of bigger moral questions.
Yeah, I think so. I think when you are a policy wonk and you are thinking, and your job is to think about pensions, you're only going to think about how to make that particular pension system work. But the fact is that people are doing multiple things. And like you said, and again, there is some research that shows that given where India is, it may actually, the returns to educating your children might actually be higher than returns from investing in pension funds. That's a distinct possibility. And that is something that you should consider.
That's a higher level question, therefore.
There's one more dimension in which, with the benefit of hindsight, I feel we went wrong. Right from the design of the intervention, which took place in 2002, there was always this clarity that every existing worker and pensioner as of 2003 is fully protected, will get their DB pension. Okay, so that's a tax upon the government. That's a challenge upon the government to pay pensions to all existing pensioners and workers. On top of that, there was the 10% wage hike to all the workers, which was done when the NPS was introduced. So the government was spending more to start building up the corpus, the personal wealth of all the new employees from 1104 onwards. Now, I feel that we needed to say more and say clearly to all concerned and to all policymakers that this is a very noble thing to do, but for one generation, you're actually paying double. You're paying both. You're paying that 10% wage hike to all the workers, to using which we are pre-funding their future pension costs into the DC account, and we are paying all the old people. It's going to be expensive, and the real gains are only going to come when the 20-year-old of 2004 becomes 60. That is 40 years from now, 2047. On that day, that person retires, goes off into the sunset with the NPS corpus, and the government has to pay nothing by way of defined benefit pensions. That's the kind of time scale on which the Indian state benefits. We needed to hang in there for those long time horizons. It's actually a bit better than that because there are pensioners and workers who are dying along the way. But there's a long period in which there is no ready fiscal gains that are obtained. In the long run, the problem is solved. I feel we didn't talk enough about this and we didn't evangelize, or the pensions community did not stay together. So pensions work moved from DA to DFS. The researchers all packed up their bags and left. And the field of pension reforms basically emptied out.
And one more thing that happened was, as I was saying, that government employees were not told or given enough information about what this new system is, and therefore there was a lot of concern about how much money they are going to get at the end of their working life. Now, one of the response of the government was that, okay, fine, we will just increase the contribution rate from 10%, our contribution rate from 10% to 14%. So earlier it was 10 plus 10, now it is 14 plus 10. So the employee continues to contribute 10%, but the government as employer now puts in 14%. What this has done is that it has increased the burden on the government, because it's putting in an additional 4%, and the old OPS payouts continue anyway. And now you've also increased the burden of the NPS. And not sure how happy that has made the people that were disgruntled, because the root cause of the problem was the fact that they did not know what exactly this system is. They did not know what is the accumulation that they are likely to get. And I'm not sure that that problem has been solved. All you've said is now we'll give you 14%, but that still leaves me with a lot of uncertainty around what I am going to get.
And you still have those earlier pension schemes going. You still have OPS, EPS. You have the problem of OROP coming up, for example, which became such a political hot potato. So take me a bit through all of those, because I think what happens when institutional memory changes is that every new person who tackles a problem, whether it is a wonk or a bureaucrat or a politician, has to then take in this entire landscape from scratch. And there may not be a Surendra Dave or an Ajay Shah to kind of help you in the sort of primer that you've given me just now. So what is that landscape looking like? What is the discourse around pensions looking like?
I think the big event that happened was in 2014, where they actually announced one rank, one pension. So as far as I know, that earlier the armed forces were supposed to be a part of the NPS, but because they retire earlier, their contribution rate could not just be 10 plus 10, right? Something else had to be done. And that was not worked out in 2002, but the idea was that we will work it out over time. However,
I was part of that. So I did conversations with Army, Navy, and the Air Force. In each case, I spoke with groups of the leadership, and I explained this entire reform. And there was this rough plan that the civil people in the armed forces would go into NPS right away. The armed forces, new work would be done to figure out the neutral transition, because the person at a young age is transiting into a 50% pension. So they would need to be given a different arrangement rather than the 10 plus 10. And the idea was, we'll get the NPS up and running, we'll come back to you and we'll do that negotiation. Somewhere, and this was in the NDA 1 period, somewhere in the transition to UPA, in all that uncertainty around the CPIM blocking the reform, these arrangements and agreements, somewhere they got lost, and the institutional memory was not carried forward, and it never got done. So then that was left as a difficult problem of what is to be done on the military pension.
And then in 2014, we went ahead and announced the one rank, one pension, which, as Ajay was talking about earlier, there is inflation indexation and then there is wage indexation. And OROP was really wage indexation, and it increased the pension burden by huge amounts. I think, again, we were discussing how government employees see the fiscal burden and the impact that it may have on the pensions that they actually get 30 years down the line when it is time for them to get the pension. Another way this affects the landscape is that you may not get pay hikes. That if the government is fiscally constrained, then you may see changes in the way the pay commission works. You may see changes in the way that pay hikes happen. And for example, in the case of defense pensions, the Agniveer scheme may be a result of the increasing pensions burden because of the OROP.
Basically, your current army would suffer because you can't afford the pensions you promised.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And
Finally, there is no free lunch. Every expert on Indian military affairs will tell us that there's something singularly lopsided in the Indian military configuration, where the bulk of money goes into wages and pensions, and there's relatively little money available for equipment and training. So, as an example, in China, we have seen giant downsizing of the military by about half. where they are shifting money away from wages and pensions into equipment and training. And that's the most important journey to build military capability in India. And instead, here we just went in the opposite direction, where we significantly increased the fraction of military spending on wages and pensions.
So you asked me what is the pensions discourse like today. So I think what we are seeing is this huge burden because of OROP, and you're seeing many states reversing back to the OPS. So I think 5 states in the last 1 year have announced that, starting from this date, I'm going to now stop contributing to the NPS, and then I'm going to go back to the old pension scheme for my employees. Now that is a serious cause for concern, because one is the fiscal burden that it may put on the state, but the second is the lack of information on how is it that they are going to go back to the OPS. So what does it mean when you say that from today onwards I stop contributing and my employees will now get a pension? Based on which rules? Are they going to be the same old rules that your earlier employees were a part of, or are you going to design some new rules? What are you going to do of the money that you have already put in the NPS? Legally, you may not be allowed to take that money from the PFRDA, because by now it's subscriber money, and the PFRDA Act may not allow the PFRDA to actually give access to this money. So what is the process by which the state governments are actually going to make this happen? And then there is concern that other state governments might follow suit. So one pensions discourse is this whole fiscal mess of shifting back to the OPS, and then how do you shift back? Other states probably shifting back to the OPS, and then this push by the union that you should not shift to the OPS. And I think that is the correct stance.
In this, we should not forget that the wage of the worker was raised from 100 to 110, and then 20 went off as the NPS contribution. So strictly, if you want to go back to the OPS, you need to knock off 10 from the wage. Okay, and I don't know whether states are doing that. And if they're not doing that, then there's something, not correct in how they've approached this. And the second, as Renuka emphasized, whatever monies have built up for the employee in their NPS accounts is the personal wealth of that employee. So it may be the decision of a state that now we will no longer contribute to those accounts, but that money is not available to the state government. That money is the private property of the individual. And I don't think anybody who has proposed going back to OPS has understood these ramifications and shown a fully articulated strategy on how to navigate this situation. I think it's slogans that let's go back to OPS. But there's a fiscal mess. There is this wage question. There is the money stranded sitting in the personal accounts. How are you going to finance the OPS? All these questions have not been satisfactorily answered.
Explain to me, what is the political impetus for such slogans to come up and for such slogans to actually work? Like, which are the interest groups or constituencies that want to go back to the OPS, and why is it so popular that parties are pushing it despite knowing it is wrong?
So it's unclear to me, right? Because the states that have gone back to the OPS are the non-BJP states. The interest group has to be just the government employees who are now part of the NPS but want the 50% of the last wage. Now, from a politician's perspective, this is a minor group, in terms of voting. So if I want to come back to power, how much does this group really matter when I am trying to, win elections? So it's surprising to me why this has got on so much traction and why state governments are so keen and make this a poll promise, really, that if you elect me, I'm going to take you back to the OPS. So I haven't, quite placed the maths of why this has become such a political issue.
And that's especially the case where earlier the grand story you told before the break, Ajay, was one of, political bipartisanship, different parties coming together to say that let's do this is good for the country. So now for, certain parties to go back and say, no, let's go back to the OPS. And when they full well know what the math behind it and the reasoning behind it, it's feels odd to me. But
one possibility, Amit, is the miscalculation of access to NPS money. So imagine that I'm in a bit of a fiscal mess right now for various reasons. And if I stop paying to the NPS, that contribution I save. And if I could get access to the amount that is already accumulated, then that
You
significantly
mean
helps
you
me.
are a state government?
Yes, I'm a state government. And if I'm able to access the money that is accumulated for employees of my state, then it significantly helps me in my fiscal situation today. And, tomorrow when they retire, I'll deal with it tomorrow. I don't have to deal with it today. If that was the calculation, right, that could have been the calculation. We do not know. If that was the calculation, then I see why that is valuable. But clearly, it's not easy to access the money in the NPS. And the PFRDA and the union government have flatly refused as of now. And I think that that is the correct stance. Because really, it is, as Ajay said, the private wealth of the employee. It is his money now. And in fact, the Act does not allow you to take that money. So if it's probably a calculation gone wrong, but we don't know for sure.
What I want to know is, paint for me in as concrete terms as you can how much of a horrible impact the going back to the OPS would have for India. Because when I did a long episode with Jayaprakash Narayan, his whole thing was like he's had a long career in public life, and he was saying this is the one thing that keeps me up at night. It is massive. So give me a sense of why he was so worried.
We have old data. We don't have current data. The paper that was written by Surendra Dave and Gautam Bharadwaj showed us that the implicit debt associated with the old pension scheme was of the order of 68% of GDP. So in a way, when you flip these decisions that take it on, take it off, the number you're talking about is maybe 68% of GDP. Okay, so we've not done that kind of calculation with current data. We don't know where it stands. No documents released by the government guide us on how to think about this, but that gives you a flavor of the magnitudes involved. Okay, or alternatively, imagine the NPS had never happened. Okay, you take the annual pension payments as we saw them in the late 90s. I was saying to you, there was an explosive growth in the compound rate of change of the pension payments. And those numbers were so explosive that they would just completely disrupt public finance. Oh, and by the way, that was not OROP. Okay, things are even worse today because for the defense folks, now you have OROP. So if you go back to the OPS fully today, we are discussing something worse than 68% of GDP because now we have OROP. So these are the magnitudes involved. They're staggering magnitudes. So we'd have to look at, one Rajasthan at a time or one Himachal Pradesh at a time and understand the full ramifications. Public finance at the state level in India does not work very well. The states don't face incentives from a bond market where better fiscal behavior generates better access to borrowing or lower interest rates. So we're just in a place with bad incentives. The states don't care about worsening their fiscal position. And then, maybe I'll say to you that many an election is won with a margin of less than 3%. So once this idea took root in the minds of many civil servants, in my opinion, wrongly, that NPS was not a good deal, then it becomes a vote bank to chase.
So tell me if I've understood this correctly, Renuka, from what you were talking about what possible incentives could have been. One is Ajay is making the point that this is not an insubstantial vote bank and etc. etc. And also, I guess your proximate exposure of any politician would be to all the civil servants and government servants around him, and he might overestimate the impact of it. But also there are sort of the fiscal incentives that the cost of going back to OPS is in the future. A future government at a future date, perhaps headed by a future party, will deal with it. They'll deal with it when they deal with it. But the benefit is in the present. The benefit is in the present in two ways. One, you're no longer contributing the 10% or 14% or whatever. So you save that. And the other is if there is a delusion that you can somehow access the NPS funds and whatever was contributed by private individuals and should rightfully be theirs. But if they are from your state, maybe, that delusion might have been there. And I hope it is indeed a delusion and they don't actually sort of get hold of the funds. Is that an accurate sort of summation?
And one more, there are no researchers.
There are no?
There are no researchers.
Explain.
There's just nobody in the system who studies these things, makes data sets, writes papers, makes calculations. The poets around here, they write nothing at all. They just stand by and let it all be.
So here's a question. I'm guessing that the parties involved, you yourself describe how you had once given a talk to young Congress MPs and explained the whole thing to them, and and UPA one after all did so much work making this happen, and they were convinced by it. But now the Congress party itself in these states is pushing hard for it. They know it is wrong. They know it is disastrous. It is not as if they have somehow been convinced and I can't grok that. I can't, like, I understand that you do some things for political imperatives and perhaps you don't understand the economics well enough, and therefore you just, you focus only on the politics of it. But here they understand the economics well enough. They know what they're doing wrong. They know what they're doing is harmful for the country, and they're doing it anyway. I mean, what's going on there?
So I have no personal information or insight into what their reasoning is in recent years. My intuition is that this has become high stakes elections. So in a winner takes all system, the behavior of both sides becomes more and more unpleasant. So, as Kelkar always says, that political parties should go into the opposition but never go out of power. But we in India have increasingly monopolized power in the hands of the executive of the ruling party, and then elections become more and more unpleasant.
For listeners tuning in now, I should explain that the Kelkar you're referring to is Vijay Kelkar, co-author of the wonderful book In Service of the Republic, and you guys have both also sort of done an episode with me. There's also a further larger question, a larger question to the larger question here of sort of the question of means versus ends in politics, because the rationale for, say, the Aam Aadmi Party doing some of what they do, like Hanuman Chalisa and whatever, and the Congress doing some of what they do, would be that, look, the greater evil is, whoever is in power, we need to remove that particular government, and justifies the means, and we're going to do it anyway. And the Gandhian position on this and my position on this is that no, the end never justifies the means, right? And that is just flat out such a wrong way of thinking.
No, I want to locate this in the phrase that I used, high stakes elections. In healthy democracies, elections have low stakes. It's not the life and liberty of the protagonists that is at stake. When institutions degrade and the dangers faced by any party that loses become more and more considerable, then people become more and more desperate to win elections, and then means and ends get degraded. So I feel we've got to locate this in the evolution of the republic, where I remember in 2004 when Manmohan Singh became prime minister, for some time there was some difficulty on housing for Mr. Vajpayee, and Mr. Manmohan Singh and Vajpayee shared the same house, and they had breakfast every day and they talked in a friendly way. And that is a healthy environment. That is a sound democracy. Then you get a certain comfort in how elections take place. It doesn't become winner takes all.
Is it bad luck with personalities or a flaw in the design that we are having high stakes elections?
Ultimately, my reasoning about public policy is always that everything comes from formal rules. There are lines in the constitution, there are lines in relevant acts that have induced maladies. So ultimately, to solve these things, we have to go fix those lines.
So let's get back to talking about what are the other things that are happening in the pensions universe, as it were.
Of course, so one of the things that we just discussed was the fiscal crisis around the shift back to the OPS. I think the other interesting thing that is happening is how we think about investments and how we think about equity investments and global investments in particular. So, for example, whether you look at the fund managers within the NPS or you look at the EPFO, which is the other big fund manager, we are all governed by some sense of some investment guidelines that the respective organizations have put out. those guidelines were very restrictive in the beginning. Only now have we accepted equity investments, when actually equity investments are very important to get higher accumulations. We are still very averse to investing in global markets. And I think that's a big cost, because we worry that this is Indian money going out. And what we are not seeing is the importance of diversification of money, and how the only free lunch in is diversification, and we are completely cutting off our people from global diversification. And I think that's a big problem, and I feel like there is absolutely no shift in this position in the last 20 years. So we hated sending money abroad then, we hate it now. At most, we are doing a little bit of equity investment, but not much more. And even when it comes to bonds and government bonds, we are still going by these mandates where each institution has to put some 25% in certain kinds of bonds and 35% in other kinds of bonds. And I want to tie it back to what Ajay just said, which is the incentives that the state governments raising money face, because they know that these organizations have to buy their bonds, they have to subscribe. There is no differential between a state that is good fiscally and a state that is bad fiscally. Because, hey, what is the competition in trying to raise funds? And who is there on the other side seeing whether you are a better managed state or a worse, badly managed state? Because everybody has these investment guidelines that they have to adhere to. There is an implicit sovereign guarantee. And so, this whole math just breaks down. And I feel that, again, it's one of those sad stories that there has just been absolutely no shift on this position in the last 20 years. And I think that is a problem. And so, in fact, this is not a discourse in pensions, but it should fundamentally be there. It should be something that all of us are talking about a lot more, because the cost, we always worry about volatility and what if the pensioner or the subscriber loses money, but we are not talking about the cost of the subscriber never making enough money. Because you put his money in these low investment return type of bonds, and you ended up having this economy where there is so much financial repression that you just cannot distinguish between a good state government and a bad state government, because the interest rates are roughly very similar. So I think that's one thing that is not being said and that needs to be said when it comes to pensions.
Exactly as Renuka said, in the late 90s and the early 2000s, there was actually a more sane pensions discourse, where it was understood that equity investment in a defined contribution system generates those kinds of plausible long-run rates of return that fund dignity in old age without requiring ridiculously high savings rates. We came to the subject of global diversification only later. Renuka has one of the first papers on that subject, and there is a huge gain to the worker from having globally diversified equities instead of equities only in India. But actually, over the last 20 years, neither in terms of the implementation of policy nor in terms of the quality of the discourse have things gotten solved. In fact, they've gotten worse. So if you are going to take money and put it into government bonds and a little bit of Indian equities, then actually the case for DC is weaker. So if there are workers saying that we don't like the prospective performance of this NPS, we can see a bit of that, because the arguments and the logic and the calculations that persuaded Vajpayee about the move to NPS did involve significant amount of equity exposure. And of course, international diversification is another magic. You can improve the reward to risk ratio by about 2x by being in globally diversified equities instead of Indian equities. But the present Indian economic policy establishment does not see opening up to Indian assets leaving the country as being part of their macroeconomic and financial strategic thinking.
Two questions. And the first one is this, that Ajay, you were also part of the group that formulated and I think wrote the very first GST bill or whatever. You worked on that. And I've always held that the GST, the way it was implemented, like it's a great concept, but the way it was implemented was a disaster. And I hate what it is right now. And it is just such a nightmare for so many small and medium sized businesses. And there was a big difference there between the dream of the GST and the reality of it. And maybe that's another episode at another time, though I've had many episodes in the past on the GST, which I'll link from the show notes. And it seems to me that over here also in the MPS, there is that same problem of dream and reality, that you look at the dream and you're looking at, okay, you have multiple fund managers investing in equities, all of this is happening. But the reality is that I immediately, begin to wonder that, look, why the hell should I put my money here? If I can invest it myself in an index fund, I will definitely do better than, what
So,
I'm getting here.
dog fooding. I'm not a customer of the NPS.
You're not a customer of the NPS.
I just go directly to index funds.
Here's my second question for both of you. And I started by using the term, but both of you have used it extensively in your answers. And the term is discourse, right? And I want to sort of narrow down on that A, discourse of who? What do we mean? And there are two options. One is the policy making elites, where the sense is that, as you pointed out, Ajay, the discourse in 99 was much better than what it is today. And I want to know why it has degraded. And the other part of the who, the other possible answer is a general public discourse. And my question there is that public discourse also worth attempting to influencing? Can it be done? And does that also, what is the importance of that discourse going in the direction that we want? Because this is such a complex, geeky, wonky subject that I cannot imagine that the public discourse can come to terms with it. It will always come down to simple sloganeering and etc. etc. So, two questions: elite discourse, why has it degraded? And public discourse, does something need to be done there? Does it make a difference?
I think when it comes to elite discourse, there is probably a degradation in the what we are seeing in the research community more generally, in terms of the funding that is available for researchers, in terms of data sets that are made available, in terms of access to various people who might be more openly and willingly able to talk about what is going on. Well, in some ways it has gotten better. Perhaps not in the pension space. In some other spaces, I think that I don't want to be fully pessimistic about this. So there are new organizations and new people coming up, but certainly in this space, I feel that we've given up.
Why?
So let's go back to the late 90s. Somehow a bunch of people came together. Okay, I described Ministry of Social Justice, Anand Bodia, AP Singh. I emphasized the unique
Self-sacrifice of Maneka Gandhi.
Yeah, and I emphasize the unique coordinating role of Gautam Bharadwaj of the Invest India Economic Foundation, who raised money from philanthropic sources for organizing research on pension reforms. And, without that, this stuff doesn't get done. And then the engagement into the DEA. And that was a proud DEA, which really was, top of the game in terms of understanding economics. I think I've mentioned in a different show to you that there was a point where Kelkar and I put together the economics capability inside that DEA, and we were better than any other economics organization in India, including any academic economics organization in India. So that combination of philanthropic funding, a coordinating organization in the form of Invest India Economic Foundation, the interest and support from the Ministry of Social Justice, the passion of Maneka Gandhi, Anand Bodia, Ashok Pal Singh, and then the DEA team, which understood the materiality of pensions and was willing to run with this. This whole thing fell apart, and at the time I didn't understand how important these things are, but now I understand these things better. That the key persons at Ministry of Social Justice all left. And then after that, Ministry of Social Justice has never been a player again in the work on pensions. And there was a brief period of philanthropic money that came into pensions research. Too many people thought that, now NPS is done, so now we don't have to do this anymore. And that was completely wrong. It's not done until 20 years have gone by. And then it moved from DEA to DFS. And whatever research capabilities and experts were there outside government all had their wires running into DEA. And so when pensions work stopped at DEA, all pensions work all over India stopped.
Yeah, I think I agree with the idea that most of us felt that NPS was done and that, it was all fine. But I want to make another point, which is that we are relying too much on this small community of people who are the policy wonks or who work on these questions. I think the larger sort of research environment in India, starting from universities, is so broken that is one reason why you have brief moments where some things just work, people come together and some magic happens, but it's not sustainable because it is not institutional. It is just a stroke of luck that some good people came together and the conditions were right, and it's not scalable. And for anything to be scalable and for us to have a research community that is working on multiple topics, and there are new people coming into these research fields all the time, means that you need to have an ecosystem of various organizations, including universities, that are housing some of these intellectual endeavors. And I think that is completely missing in this country. And so, often various fields will just degenerate because that muscle is just not there.
It strikes me that the young thinkers of today are our society's pension for tomorrow, in a manner of speaking. And as you describe it, it's kind of tragic if, that space is drying up, or if, other incentives are getting in the way.
Yeah, Amit, I think another thing that is happening in this space is that we are in a rush to implement. So, across the spectrum, so there is this view that enough thinking has happened. Now, let's just go and change things and let's just do this very fast because, India doesn't have time and we have to become, the big.
I have a phrase for this. It is called bias for action. And it is one of the truly toxic things harming the ability to think in India.
Great phrase in the creator economy, but I accept that it can be completely the other way around.
I mean, you need both. So you need organizations that are more focused on action, and you need organizations and communities that are doing some of this deep thinking. What has happened is that the latter is missing. That is, the research community is very, very broken. And whatever new money that you are seeing in the policy community has a bias for action, has a bias for impact. And now you start getting into deeper questions of what is impact. And there you begin to run into the problem of short-term versus long-term impact.
The second part of the question, the public discourse. How important is it? Can it be affected? And should we just give up there on complex issues like this?
So in the late 90s and early 2000s, that community that I described to you was an elite policy thinking community and an elite media community. But I think the work was good enough and the messages were sound and the messages percolated. So I remember being surprised at how many people got on board and started by and large understanding and supporting the idea. So I don't think it was that difficult to get these ideas out into the mainstream discourse. That worked out pretty well. But when that policy community dispersed, then after that there was nothing. Then there was a vacuum. So I feel it was in the vacuum that various wonky ideas gained prominence, certainly fanned and supported by trade unions of civil servants and their WhatsApp groups and so on.
And their WhatsApp groups.
I think I'd like to add, I think it's extremely important to have the public discourse. Also, take the example of something that animates people, which is guaranteed returns. So if you were to just go out on the street and ask people, give them a choice between a product that, is inferior from all technical points of view, but it gives you a guaranteed rate of return, and you will see that people make that choice. And I think that people, for example, do not understand the cost of the guarantee that they are paying. There is a price to be paid for guaranteed returns, and nobody knows that. And part of the reason that nobody knows that is public discourse on this is completely missing. And that's where, again, the big gap is. That many, many issues where I think public opinion matters, and we've just not been able to percolate that message.
Another larger question, and I'm going to zoom out a little bit to to maybe get some perspective on this. At one level, what we discussed earlier about the incentives of states, it seems to me that states will always have that incentive, and it's like a dual incentive. And one is that you shift cost to the future so you get benefits now. So, in that sense, going back to the OPS is practically a no brainer, even if they can't access the NPS funds. And the other one also is that making sure that costs are dispersed among the people, benefits are concentrated, and then those flow back to you in terms of political funding or whatever, etc., etc. And given that these incentives exist, I would imagine that it is then inevitable that good policies and ideas will get degraded in the way that seems to have happened to this. That's just the belly of the beast. What you described earlier, Ajay, was like a perfect storm of people and ideas coming together. But it seems to me to be a bit of an outlier, given institutional design, given the design of the government and the incentives. I would not expect that to be the case. I would expect that very much to be the exception, and perhaps we're lucky we had the exception, but it was an exception. So, but the larger question, but I don't want to aimlessly kind of lament and rant about this. My larger question there is that has such fundamental pension reform worked anywhere else in the world? Because similar political and bureaucratic incentives would exist in all systems to some extent or the other. So, is there a story for hope for us to get inspired by from anywhere else in the world?
Elsewhere in the world, in many countries, the problem was not just a defined benefit for civil servants, but a defined benefit for the population. So the conditions in many other countries were way worse than what was present in India. And numerous countries have done the switch to DC. So this is the problem we faced was not an unusually big problem. In fact, there was a reasonably easy solution, which was for one generation, pay both and you are done. In other countries, they've actually had to suffer the political angst of reneging on the DB promise and bringing in a DC. But this has been done in many countries. Not that they are geniuses or anything. It is that pension promises are so scary and so destructive of public finance that they had their backs against the wall. And in advanced economies, you get those robust research communities and the quality of the policy discourse is higher. There are less mistakes in policy implementation. The kind of story we described about the loss of institutional memory and accumulation of mistakes is more a third world scenario. But yeah, there are many, many countries that have moved mountains on the move from DB to DC.
And yet, the failures of countries like the United States to solve its social security problem highlight how difficult it is to do.
So, illuminating conversation, I think I listened to this multiple times and kind of try to process all that I've learned. And there's plenty I've learned at a higher level of how little institutional things or wonky things like pensions and all of that can just change the structure of society itself, as you described in the first half. And equally, I hadn't, I think, realized what a massive sort of problem this is, and in my opinion, not just a problem of economics but also a problem of politics, that we have this move back to an old scheme which will bankrupt future generations, from a new scheme which was not properly understood. So I want to ask you guys, like, a final question to sort of end, which is that if I ask you to look ahead 20 years from now, what is a best case scenario and what is a worst case scenario that you see in, I guess, this context of it playing out, but also in a larger context, because pensions, in one sense, are a proxy for how people within a society plan for the future, plan for old age, how they look at savings, how, etc., etc., the structure of their lives. So give me a best case and a worst case scenario.
I think the best case scenario is that we stay on course on NPS. The states that have reversed to OPS find good hybrid schemes, for example, or come back to the NPS and we stay the course. So I think that's my best case scenario. The worst case scenario on this question is just a complete unraveling, that state after state now just, goes back to the OPS, and at some point the union also does. And then we have the NPS architecture only available to citizens of India on a voluntary basis, or doing some stuff on informal sector pensions. So I think that would be my worst case scenario. And then we will have to confront the fiscal problem when it comes.
Yeah. So the worst case scenario is that the infection jumps from one state to the next, and many more states go this way, and potentially the union abandons the NPS. And then it's practically like the NPS reform never happened. And just like there was an explosive growth of pension payments in the late 90s, you'll get back to an explosive growth in pension payments now, just a wee bit worse because of OROP. So it will be every bit as bad as conditions in 1999 with the kicker of an OROP layered on top of it. So it will be an explosive growth in pension expenses, which will crowd out other uses of public money. That's the worst scenario. In the good scenario, some people are able to come together and become a thinking community for pensions. Okay? That's how high the challenge is, because nothing less will work. This, lurching from one decision to another doesn't work. This stuff is too big and too complex and too important for it to be played day to day on file where some official or the other makes a decision. What we need is to get back to a research community, a collaboration with the relevant policymakers, where there are data sets, there are papers, there are conferences, there is criticism. And then the piloting of pension policy comes onto some better ground. And then we are actually able to get back to the NPS, maybe contain the damage at the 5, or maybe ideally get the 5 back to an NPS. And in that case, 20 years from now, things are looking very good, because 20 years from now, 2043, is almost at the end of that double payment generation. Then you start reaping the fruits of the reform.
Then you're not paying at all.
Yeah. So whatever people are coming out the pipeline and becoming pensioners are imposing no cost on the government, because they're taking their personal pension wealth and going off into the sunset. They're decoupled, they're de-risked from public finance. And all the old OPS people would have subsided in terms of the magnitude of their payments by 2043. So in the 2040s, the NPS reform would be a huge source of assistance to the fiscal health of the union government, of the state governments, but not yet the military folk. That's a separate battle to be solved. So potentially 20 years from now is the time to be reaping the pension reforms dividend of the seeds of which were planted in 2002. So this is how good it can be. This is how bad it can be.
I propose a date. The three of us will get together again here in September 2043 and we'll record an episode and we'll talk about this. Meanwhile, let me end on a note about the public discourse. That a friend of mine from Delhi or Dali or whatever you want to call it, he called me the other day and he said, ki yaar Amit, main bahut worried hua. I said, kya hua bhai? So he said, yaar, fiscal problem hai. I was like, ki, I've never known bhai to talk about fiscal problem, government, monetary inflation, pata nahi kya bolega. So I was like, हाँ बोल क्या fiscal problem है. He said कि यार बहुत मोटा हो गया वो जिम जाना है, fiscal problem है. And on this note, Renuka and Ajay, thank you so much for coming on the show. I've had such an awesome time.
Last humor of the day, the great economist Marty Feldstein used to always say to me that a chronic fiscal problem is like being 100 pounds overweight. So you're living, you feel you're fine, you're gorging, you're having a good meal, but it is hollowing out your body, it is destroying your health, and it is the source of so many other kinds of damage.
I don't want to fat shame myself, but just because you're gorging doesn't mean you're gorgeous. Thank you. अरे कुछ तो बोलो, thank you, कुछ तो बोलो.
Thank you, Amit. It was a pleasure being here.
If you enjoyed listening to this episode, check out the show notes, enter rabbit holes at will. Also, check out the YouTube show Everything is Everything, which is on YouTube at youtube.com/Amit Varma. My name, AMITVARMA. We've already had 13 episodes out. It's fantastic. Do listen. You can follow Ajay on Twitter at Ajay_Shah. You can follow Renuka on Twitter at Resane, RESANERING. It's also linked from the show notes. You can follow me on Twitter at Amit Varma, AMITVARMA. You can browse past episodes of The Seen and the Unseen at seenunseen.in. Thank you for listening. Did you enjoy this episode of The Seen and the Unseen? If so, would you like to support the production of the show? You can go over to seenunseen.in/support and contribute any amount you like to keep this podcast alive and kicking. Thank you.